1,000 Space Marines, one planet. The math seems simple, until it isn't. The galaxy's finest warriors, gene-forged demigods in ceramite armor, face a truth the Imperium refuses to acknowledge. The numbers don't add up. They never have. On the burning world of Carthax Prime, Chapter Master Vortigern of the Iron Requiem stands before a hololithic display showing a planet of 19 billion souls in open rebellion. His chapter numbers 847 battle brothers. The Administratum has sent no reinforcements. None are coming. The globe rotates slowly before him, casting pale blue light across the Strategium's darkened walls. Continent-spanning hive cities pulse with red markers. Each one represents a population greater than most imperial worlds. 60 million armed insurgents, 15,000 armored vehicles, atmospheric defense networks capable of shredding drop pods before they breach the cloud layer. Vortigern's scarred face betrays nothing. 400 years of service to the Emperor have taught him to mask every emotion behind ceramite discipline. First Captain Theron stands at his right shoulder, data slate in hand, scrolling through tactical assessments that grow bleaker with every line. Chief Librarian Malvox hovers near the chamber's edge, his psychic hood crackling with suppressed energy. Master of the Forge Caelius examines the orbital defense schematics, his mechadendrites twitching with calculation. None of them speak. The numbers speak loudly enough. A full Astartes chapter represents the pinnacle of human military engineering. Each Space Marine equals 100 mortal soldiers in combat effectiveness. Some calculations suggest 1,000. But even generous mathematics cannot bridge this gap. 800 warriors against 60 million. The ratio defies sanity. Yet, this is the Imperium's way. This has always been the Imperium's way. The rebellion on Carthax Prime began as whispers in manufactorum break halls. Workers questioning why their children starved while tithe ships departed laden with grain. Whispers became protests. Protests became riots. Riots became organized resistance. Now, 3 years later, the planet has declared independence from the God Emperor's light. Worse still, intelligence suggests chaos corruption has taken root among the rebel leadership. The taint spreads through the population like infection through blood. Vortigern dismisses his officers with a gesture. One by one, they file out through the Strategium's armored doors. When the last footstep fades, he stands alone before the display, watching the hololithic planet spin through its endless rotation. He speaks to the empty room, his voice a low rumble that reverberates off ancient metal walls. The Administratum believes we are myths, legends made flesh. They think we cannot fail because failure is not written in our gene code. He reaches out. His gauntleted finger touches the hololithic representation of the planet's primary hive. The image distorts around his touch, pixels scattering like frightened insects. They are wrong. We fail constantly. We simply ensure no one survives to report it. The stakes crystallized in that moment. The Imperium's most closely guarded secret hung in the air between Vortigern and the hololithic display. Space Marines were not enough. They had never been enough. The myth of Astartes' invincibility persisted only because the Imperium controlled the narrative. Failed campaigns were classified or attributed to other causes. The alternative was admitting that humanity's greatest defenders were spread impossibly thin across a galaxy of horrors. Vortigern makes his decision. He will conquer Carthax Prime with 847 Space Marines. He will do so not through overwhelming force. That luxury does not exist. He will achieve victory through terror, precision, and the calculated application of violence so extreme that 19 billion souls will choose submission over extinction. The chapter master activates his personal vox. Static crackles through the strategium. All company commanders to the strategium. We deploy in 6 hours. He pauses, staring at the burning world rotating before him. Red markers spread across its surface like open wounds. And summon Chaplain Morthane. We will need sermons of particular conviction for what comes next. The vox clicks, silent. Vortigern remains motionless, a statue of scarred ceramite and unyielding purpose. Beyond the strategium's reinforced viewports, the Iron Requiem fleet holds position in high orbit. 7 strike cruisers and 2 battle barges hang against the void, their hulls dark against the stars. Against a world of 19 billion, they appear insignificant. 9 vessels, 800 warriors, one impossible mission. The scale is absurd. The mission defies reason. And yet, there is no alternative. There never is. Space Marines do not retreat. They do not surrender. They conquer or they die, and their deaths accomplish what their lives could not. Carthax Prime burns below, unaware that its fate has already been sealed by a scarred giant, standing alone in a darkened room, calculating the precise mathematics of controlled annihilation. Chief Librarian Malvox walked the corridors of the battle barge. Inevitable verdict. The deck plating thrumming with the contained power of the ship's plasma drives. His psychic senses, a faculty as natural to him as sight, brushed against the minds of his brothers as they prepared for deployment. Each consciousness was a burning pyre of purpose, a fortress of faith built upon the terrible weight of genetic memory. But beneath that fire, where the shadows gathered, Malvox detected something the others would never admit, even to themselves. Doubt. It was a cold spot in the heart of the flame, a hairline fracture in the foundation of their conviction. His path took him toward the librarium, his mind sifting through the accumulated knowledge of his office. He remembered the tactical doctrines of the Codex Astartes, the masterwork of the Primarch Roboute Guilliman. He remembered how those doctrines assumed a chapter would never fight alone. The Codex spoke of combined arms operations, of Imperial Guard formations numbering in the millions, of Navy support and Titan legions and Mechanicum auxiliaries. A chapter was designed to be the tip of the spear, not the entire weapon. But the Imperium was dying. It had been dying for 10,000 years. The resources that once supported the Legiones Astartes had been diverted, depleted, or destroyed. Chapters now fought alone more often than not. Their requests for support lost in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the administratum. Their pleas ignored by officials who viewed Space Marines as convenient, self-contained solutions to inconvenient problems. Malvox entered the librarium. The air was cold and still, thick with the scent of ancient parchment and ozone from the data crystals that lined the vaulted chamber. Here, the history of the Imperium's wars was stored, a library of triumph and atrocity. He accessed the archives, his mind sifting through records of similar campaigns. The Siege of Vrax, 17 years of attrition, millions of guardsmen dead, to take a single fortress world. The Badab War, chapter against chapter, worlds burned, a decade of bloodshed that achieved nothing but ruin. The Third War for Armageddon, the combined might of 3 chapters, countless guard regiments, and multiple Titan legions, and still the great beast Gazgakul Thraka was not destroyed. The numbers never added up. The librarian found what he was looking for, a classified account from the M39 archives. The Carvax suppression. The Marines errant had attempted to pacify a rebellious agri-world with 400 battle brothers. The document was heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out by inquisitorial seals, but the conclusion remained starkly visible. Total chapter losses, 47%. Pacification achieved. Subsequent exterminatus authorized due to irreparable social collapse. They had won. And then the Inquisition burned the world anyway. The victory had been too costly, too slow, too damaging to the planet's ability to meet its tithe obligations. Victory was not enough. Malvox understood the lesson. A space marine conquest had to be swift, decisive, and it had to leave something worth ruling. He closed his eyes. Composing a psychic message to Vortigern, he sent no words, only images and emotional impressions. The ghost of a burning world, the taste of ash on the tongue, the hollow echo of a victory that cost everything and gained nothing. The message was a warning, sharp as a shard of glass in the mind. History remembers our triumphs. History forgets our costs. Carthax Prime will be both. As the psychic echo faded, his attention was drawn to a deeper archive, a fragmentary text from the age of the Great Crusade. It described how the Luna Wolves, the legion of the War Master Horus himself, had conquered a world of similar population with only 3 companies. The tactics were considered so extreme that the Emperor had personally ordered the records partially expunged. What remained spoke of a campaign of psychological devastation so complete that the world's population simply stopped resisting, their collective will to fight shattered beyond recovery. The fragment contained a single surviving tactical designation, a phrase that chilled Malvox to the core of his transhuman soul. The Cull Protocol. He knew he should report this to Vortigern immediately. All intelligence was the chapter master's by right. Instead, he hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ancient, forbidden text. Some weapons, once used, could not be unused. Some victories left scars that never healed, not on worlds, but on the victors themselves. The strategium hummed with the contained energy of 43 gods of war. The air, recycled and cold, tasted of machine oil and sanctified incense. Ceramite-clad giants, the 10 captains of the Iron Requiem and the masters of its Reclusium, Librarium, Apothecarian, and Armory, filled the chamber. Their sheer mass displaced reality, their presence a physical weight. At the chamber's center, beneath the harsh, shifting light of the hololithic display, stood Chapter Master Vortigern. He had served the Emperor for 400 years, commanded this chapter for 60, and led 17 planetary conquests. He had never faced odds this unfavorable. The briefing began not with rhetoric, but with the cold arithmetic of defeat. First, Captain Theron, a warrior whose mind was as precise and unforgiving as a targeting cogitator, delivered the numbers. Carthax Prime. 4 major continental landmasses, 17 primary hive cities. Estimated population density makes this world one of the most heavily inhabited in the subsector. The hololith shifted, displaying geographic overlays. The rebellion controls all major infrastructure. They have systematically eliminated loyal Imperial forces over 3 years of preparation. Master of the Forge. Caelius added the material dimension. His voice, filtered through a vox grill, was the grating sound of metal on stone. The rebels have seized substantial portions of Carthax Prime's industrial output. They are producing crude but functional armored vehicles, artillery, and small arms. Of greater concern are the orbital defense platforms. The display highlighted a network of weapon emplacements in high orbit. Ancient technology, pre-imperial. Their accuracy is surprising. Any direct, large-scale drop will cost us vessels we cannot replace. The assessment concluded. Silence. Then the debate began. Third Captain Ashavar, his armor still bearing the scorch marks of the last campaign, advocated for immediate, overwhelming violence. We drop directly into Hive Primus. We kill their leadership. Terror will spread faster than any army. His philosophy was the core of Astartes' doctrine. Shock, not attrition. Strike the head, and the body dies. Fourth Captain Lycos, whose company specialized in reconnaissance and infiltration, disagreed vehemently. We know nothing of their command structure. 3 years of rebellion has produced leaders we haven't identified. We strike blindly, and we kill only figureheads, while the true architects escape to rebuild from the shadows. The argument intensified, a fault line cracking through the chapter's leadership. The younger captains, their gene seed burning with inherited aggression, favored Ashavar's brutal calculus. The veterans, their caution forged in the ashes of failed campaigns where haste had led to catastrophe, sided with Lycos. Then Chaplain Morthane, Master of Sanctity, spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute authority of the Reclusium, cutting through the tactical discourse like a power blade through flesh. This is not merely a military rebellion. The air in the room grew heavy, still. Our intelligence confirms chaos corruption among the insurgent leadership. We do not fight misguided citizens. We fight the great enemy wearing human faces. Half measures invite damnation. The word chaos landed like a hammer blow. It changed everything. A rebellious population could be reconquered, re-educated, reintegrated. A corrupted population had to be purged with fire and faith. The arithmetic grew darker. How many of Carthax Prime's 19 billion souls could be saved? How many should be? Vortigern let the ensuing silence stretch, watching his officers, gauging their tactical preferences and their moral boundaries. Finally, he raised one gauntleted hand. The gesture silenced the room instantly. We will not strike blindly. We will not wait for perfect intelligence. His gaze swept across his captains. We will do what Space Marines have always done. We will adapt. He manipulated the hololithic display, the globe spinning until a single city on the planet's northern continent was highlighted in blood red. Before we conquer Carthax Prime, we will conquer Hive Secundus. 1 city, 2 billion souls. He paused, letting the scale of it sink in. With 100 Space Marines. A ripple of disbelief, quickly suppressed, passed through the assembled giants. 100 brothers against 2 billion. The ratio was not just unfavorable, it was insane. Vortigern's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. It was a terrifying sight. If we cannot take one hive with 100, we cannot take the planet with 800. This will be our proof of concept, our laboratory, our lesson. His eyes found his first captain. Theron, you will command the assault. Choose your warriors carefully. I want survivors who can teach the rest of the chapter what they learn. First Captain Theron stood alone in the vast, echoing silence of the inevitable verdicts. Primary mustering hall. The vaulted chamber, large enough to assemble a full company in battle plate, felt cavernous and empty. In his gauntleted hand, a data slate glowed with cold blue light, scrolling through the personnel files of every battle brother in the Iron Requiem. Vortigern had given him an impossible task, and with it, an impossible freedom. Any warrior, from any company, was his to command. The choice was his, and so was the failure that would inevitably follow a wrong one. His selection process was a brutal triage of souls. He was not looking for heroes. He was looking for specialists. He needed veterans whose experience spanned centuries, young warriors whose zeal had not yet been tempered by defeat, and technical experts whose skills went far beyond the simple, sacred act of killing. Apothecaries to husband the precious resource of marine lives. Tech Marines to overcome the hive's corrupted machinery. And chaplains to maintain spiritual purity in the face of the insidious enemy they now knew they faced. His stylus paused on the file of Brother Kalen, 6th Company. 40 years of service, a neophyte by the standards of the giants around him. Yet, the combat logs were an anomaly. Kalen had survived 17 engagements that had killed warriors with superior experience and war gear. The file noted an almost preternatural tactical awareness, a battlefield geometry that bordered on prescience. But it was not the gift of a librarian. Theron had interviewed the Marine. Kalen's secret was a form of heresy in itself. He thought like the enemy. He did not just predict their actions, he inhabited their perspective, calculated their optimal responses from a place of mortal fear and desperation, and positioned himself to exploit it. Against mortals, this made him terrifyingly effective. He was chosen. Next, Theron selected the antithesis of Kalen's subtlety, Brother Sergeant Helvain of the 1st Company. A veteran of 200 years, Helvain was a walking siege engine, his Terminator armor a monument to violence. The records showed him walking through massed laser fire without slowing, crushing rebel commanders beneath a lightning-wreathed power fist, and turning impossible last stands into one-sided massacres. Theron selected him not for nuance, but for the moments when nuance would inevitably fail. When the only solution was 10,000 kilograms of ceramite, adamantium, and the absolute unyielding refusal to die. The final, most controversial selection was not a Space Marine. Sister Medici Iolanthe was attached to the chapter as part of an ancient alliance with an Order Hospitaller. She was a mortal woman. When her file appeared, Theron could almost hear the grunts of disapproval from the other captains, but he had studied her reports from previous compliance actions. She understood something the Astartes struggled to grasp, how mortals think when not under fire, what they truly fear, beyond the threat of a bolter, what might convince them to submit without requiring their deaths. He needed a weapon that could save lives, not just take them. She was chosen. 12 hours later, the chosen 100 were assembled. 97 Space Marines and 3 mortal specialists. The force was irregular, top-heavy with veterans and specialists. Its composition, a direct reflection of the mission's strange and terrible demands. Theron stood before them, his unhelmed face a mask of iron resolve. He did not hide the stakes or minimize the danger. You have been selected because you represent the chapter's finest capabilities. His voice boomed through the hall. You have been selected because the chapter master believes 100 of us can accomplish what would break 1,000 lesser warriors. He let his gaze pass over each of them. You have been selected because Hive Secundus will either prove the possibility of victory or demonstrate that Carthax Prime requires exterminatus. He let the word hang in the cold, still air. The ultimate failure, the final damning admission that Space Marines are not enough. I intend to prove the former. Any who doubt their ability to contribute should speak now. No one spoke. No one moved. In the silence, there was only the grim, absolute certainty of duty. The assault began not with the scream of Thunderhawk engines, but with the dead quiet of falling junk. 30 drop pods, their exteriors modified to mimic the profile of orbital debris, shed their velocity in a silent, unpowered descent. Inside each metal coffin, a scout of the 10th Company stood braced for impact. Not yet a full battle brother, not yet granted the honor of power armor, but a specialist in the arts of infiltration and observation. Their mission? To land unseen, to identify the enemy's command structure, and to prepare the ground for the hammer that would follow. Scout Sergeant Verix led his squad through the wound they'd torn in the hive's lowest level. They were in the Underhive, a realm of perpetual darkness where the city's refuse, both material and human, had accumulated in layers dating back millennia. The air was a thick cocktail of corroded metal, toxic chemical runoff, and the cloying stench of decay. The rebels had fortified the upper spires, but had neglected these depths, assuming no sane military force would choose to operate in such a hellscape. They had fatally underestimated the adaptability of a space marine. This was a nightmare landscape. Corroded gantries crisscrossed chasms of unknown depth, and streams of glowing, noxious fluid carved paths through mountains of compacted waste. Here, in the shadows, dwelled the hive's other forgotten children. Mutants. Twisted humans whose genetics had drifted far from the Imperial baseline, their hatred for the pure humans above burning as brightly as any promethium fire. A confrontation was inevitable. As Verix's squad rounded a pillar of fused scrap, they found their path blocked by a score of them. Their bodies a grotesque collage of extra limbs and weeping sores, their hands clutching crude sharpened pipes and scavenged blades. The tension was a physical thing, a spark waiting for a breath. But Verix made a decision that was not in any tactical manual. He offered them an alliance. He promised them nothing he could not deliver. Temporary sanctuary from the coming storm, access to captured food supplies, and, most importantly, the simple, brutal acknowledgement that they were human enough to warrant his consideration. In exchange, the mutants, whose leader was a creature of unnerving intelligence, provided knowledge of the hive that would have taken weeks to gather. They knew every hidden passage, every structural weakness, every secret the surface dwellers had spent generations trying to bury. Simultaneously, miles above the Underhive, librarian Codicier Thayen extended his psychic senses. He sat unmoving aboard the strike cruiser. Righteous conviction, his mind a silent predator sweeping through the hive. He was searching for the taint of chaos, and what he discovered chilled him to the core of his enhanced physiology. The corruption was not confined to the rebel leadership. It had spread through the population like an infection through blood, a subtle psychic conditioning that made them more aggressive, more resistant to fear, more willing to die for a cause they barely understood. This was not a rebellion. This was a cultivation. Someone, or something, was farming despair. Thayen traced the psychic signature to its source, a location deep within the hive's industrial sectors, where a vast manufactorum had been repurposed. The psychic presence there felt ancient, patient, and fundamentally wrong. The scout squads established their positions, their Auspex scanners confirming the mutants' intelligence. They transmitted their findings to First Captain Theron. The picture was grim. The enemy in Hive Secundus alone exceeded 3 million armed combatants. The population was psychically primed for fanatical resistance. An unknown chaos power operated from the Hive's very heart. Theron stood before the hololith, the new data painting a portrait of a mission that had moved from impossible to insane. He could abort, report to Vortigern, reassess. Instead, he began modifying the assault plan. The Chaos presence changes our priorities. His voice was a low rumble. devoid of doubt, but not our objective. We will take Hive Secundus. We will purge the corruption. And we will demonstrate that 100 Space Marines are worth more than 3 million traitors. He turned to his assembled command squad, his eyes like chips of granite. Deploy the first wave. We descend at dawn. Their dawn. Let them see us coming. Let them know what arrives. The order was given. In the launch bay of the Righteous Conviction, the engines of a dozen Thunderhawk gunships ignited, their ferocious roar shattering the silence of the void. They dropped from the cruiser's belly, plumes of white-hot fire burning against the black, as they plunged into Carthax Prime's atmosphere. The conquest had begun. The Thunderhawks tore through the upper atmosphere at attack speed, their ceramite hulls glowing cherry red. The sky around Hive Secundus was not empty. It was a storm of fire. Explosive light bloomed in silent, deadly flowers as rebel gun emplacements, lining the Hive's highest spires, threw up a wall of flak. The revolutionaries had trained for this moment for 3 years, their hearts filled with the conviction that they were ready. They were wrong. The first wave deployed. Assault Marines, their jump packs igniting with a guttural roar, plunged from the gunship's open bays into the maelstrom. They were falling angels, clad in gunmetal gray, descending into a hell of their own making. Sergeant Ashavan led the jump, his squad carving vectors through tracer fire that would have shredded mortal aircraft. 2 of his battle brothers were struck by direct hits. One's armor integrity alarms screamed, but the ceramite held. The other fell, a silent, tumbling silhouette swallowed by the Hive's abyssal depths. First casualties. Noted. Logged. Recovery to be attempted if mission parameters allowed. Ashavan's squad landed with the force of meteorites amidst a battery of quad autocannons. Their chainswords screamed to life, a chorus of mechanical rage that bit into flesh and bone. The rebels fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. One insurgent, his face a mask of hate, threw himself onto Ashavan's roaring blade, dying only to buy his comrades a few precious seconds to reposition a heavy weapon. It was courage. It was also pointless. Within 90 seconds, the battery was a charnel house, its guns silenced. Across the Hive's sprawling upper reaches, similar scenes of brutal, efficient slaughter repeated as landing zones were secured. But the rebellion adapted with unnerving speed. Underground, shielded from the electromagnetic chaos of the battle, fiber optic networks carried a torrent of data. Rebel commanders, hidden deep within the Hive, coordinated their response. Reinforcements, drawn from reserve garrisons, began to flow toward the landing zones. The Space Marines found themselves facing not scattered, terrified defenders, but organized, disciplined counterattacks. Brother Kalen, deployed with the main tactical force pushing into a manufactorum district, demonstrated his worth. His squad advanced through a cavernous hall filled with dormant machinery when he suddenly halted, his gauntleted hand raised in the universal signal for an immediate stop. His brothers froze, their absolute trust in his instincts overriding their own senses, which detected no threat. 3 seconds later, the section of floor they would have been crossing erupted in a violent, shrieking explosion of decompressed atmosphere. A trap, using the Hive's own industrial infrastructure as a weapon. Kalen's eyes traced the trigger mechanism's residue, his mind calculating. This was not the work of a panicked mob. It was the design of someone with an intimate knowledge of the manufactorum's systems, someone who thought like a warrior. First Captain Theron established his command post in a captured hab block. Its previous occupants either fled or dead on the floor. The initial landing was a success, but it had cost them. 4 brothers killed. 11 wounded seriously enough to require the apothecary's immediate attention. Against an enemy whose numbers were counted in the millions, such losses were a death sentence delivered on the installment plan. Yet, the assault's psychological impact was proving more potent than its material damage. Across the hive, captured Vox channels and civilian data feeds crackled with panicked, fragmented reports. Angels of death! The angels of death are here! The myth, the terror cultivated over 10,000 years of imperial propaganda and genuine atrocity, was beginning its work. Civilians who might have supported the rebellion with a tossed rock or a shouted curse instead bolted for the deepest shelters. Secondary defense lines found their crews deserting their posts before a single space marine came into view. Theron monitored it all. He saw the opportunity in the chaos. The rebel leadership had not yet issued a unified, coherent response. They were hesitating, uncertain if this was the main invasion or a brilliantly executed diversion. That uncertainty was a weapon. "Signal all units," Theron commanded, his voice cutting through the command post's low din. "Maximum visibility operations. I want every citizen of this hive to know we are here. Let them count us if they can. Let them see that we are few, and let them understand that we are enough." Codicea Thyan moved through the silent grandeur of Hive Secundus's administrative district like a ghost in a tomb. The architecture was classic imperial monumentalism, towering archways, statues of forgotten heroes, and floors of polished marble now scuffed with the grime of rebellion. Around him, his tactical squad provided a perimeter of lethal vigilance, their bolters sweeping every shadow. But Thyan's true battlefield was elsewhere. His senses were not his eyes or ears, but the invisible tendrils of his psychic consciousness, extending through plasteel walls and armored conduits. He was not hunting soldiers, he was hunting data. He bypassed the encrypted military networks entirely, seeking instead the mundane pulse of the city itself. Census records, resource allocation databases, atmospheric processing logs, the million small, unglamorous transactions that formed the true lifeblood of a hive. He found it in a sub-level data archive, a repository of civic information deemed too unimportant for the rebels to either purge or heavily defend. The official census, last updated 3 years before the first riots, was precisely what imperial records suggested. Population, 2.3 billion souls. The demographics were a textbook hive pattern. 80% designated labor class, 15% commercial and administratum, 5% upper-tier nobility and enforcers. It was utterly unremarkable. But it was a lie. Thyan extended his probe into the city's life support systems. He analyzed the output of water processing nexus points, the consumption rates of recycled atmosphere, the sheer caloric volume moving through the food distribution networks. The data was raw, unfiltered, and it told a different story. The resource consumption didn't align with a population of 2.3 billion. It suggested a number closer to 3.8 billion. A cold knot of unreality tightened in Thyan's mind. There were 1.5 billion unregistered, undocumented souls living within this single hive. He cross-referenced the anomaly with historical shipping records from the Orbital Port Authority. For decades before the rebellion, a pattern emerged. Merchant vessels, flagged from obscure charter companies, had arrived carrying manifests listing heavy industrial equipment and agricultural machinery. But the cargo's declared mass never quite matched the descriptions. The discrepancy was subtle, lost in the noise of 1 trillion daily transactions. But it was there. Someone had been systematically importing human beings disguised as freight, smuggling them into the hive's unmonitored depths. The implications cascaded through Theon's mind with the force of a physical blow. The psychic conditioning he had detected earlier was not a recent phenomenon. You don't condition an existing resistant population in a few years. You import subjects, you raise them in the darkness over generations, and you cultivate them into true believers whose fanaticism is absolute, because they have never known anything else. This rebellion hadn't started 3 years ago. It had been seeded, planned, and grown for half a century. Theon withdrew his consciousness and composed a psychic message for First Captain Theron, a torrent of data, emotional impressions, and cold, hard numbers. Theron received it in his command post, the information blooming in his mind without a single word spoken. His scarred face, a mask of stoicism, did not change, but his eyes narrowed. "We are not fighting a rebellion," he said to the empty room. "We are fighting an invasion. Someone prepared this world as a fortress, imported an army disguised as a population, and lit the fuse when their work was done." As this new reality settled, a different kind of answer arrived from Master of the Forge Caelius. His tech marines had breached the hive's deep archives, a place of dust and forgotten knowledge from before the Imperium's arrival. The pre-Imperial records, stored on crystal data shards that had survived the dark age of technology, revealed that Carthax Prime had been a critical way station for humanity's expansion into this quadrant of the galaxy. The orbital defense platforms, which they had assumed were ancient but imperial, were revealed to predate the Great Crusade by at least 2,000 years. More significant, the archives referenced an agreement called the Carthax Covenant. It was a pact for mutual defense and resource sharing, signed between the world's original colonists and another party. The documents were frustratingly vague, but one fragment described the other signatory as being not entirely of the human weave. Theron received this intelligence and overlaid it with Theon's discoveries. The pieces of the puzzle locked into a terrifying mosaic. An unknown faction, quite possibly Xenos, had been preparing this world for a conflict for millennia. The rebellion, the imported population, even the chaos taint. They were all tools. They were means to an end. "We are not the only players in this game," Theron concluded grimly. He opened a secure Vox channel to the fleet in high orbit. "Chapter Master," he began, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury. "We have a complication." 72 hours into the assault, the air in First Captain Theron's makeshift command post was thick with the tang of ozone and the low hum of stressed machinery. He stood before a hololithic map of Hive Secundus, its flickering light casting long shadows that made the assembled Space Marines look like statues carved from night. The numbers scrolling at the edge of the display painted a picture of victory that felt impossibly like defeat. 11 dead. 23 wounded, though Apothecary Helix's grim genius had already returned 16 of them to combat status. 4 were missing, their transponders silent, their armor's last telemetry reading a spike of catastrophic energy in some forgotten underlevel. They were presumed dead. On the other side of the ledger, enemy casualties were estimated at 40,000, a kill ratio exceeding 3,000 to 1. It was a feat of arms that would have been celebrated as a miracle in any Imperial Guard campaign. Here, it was a death sentence. Brother Sergeant Helvane, his hulking Terminator armor a tapestry of fresh scars and blast marks, gave voice to the brutal arithmetic. "We are killing them faster than any force in the galaxy could dream," he rumbled, his gauntlet clenching into a fist that could pulverize concrete. "And it does not matter. They are not fighting to win. They are fighting to make us lose. This is death by 1,000 cuts, and we are bleeding." The tactical analysis confirmed his assessment. The rebels had abandoned any pretense of meeting the Astartes in open battle. Instead, they had turned the hive itself into a weapon. They used booby traps fashioned from industrial cutters, detonated promethium conduits as Marines passed, and sent waves of suicide attackers armed with mining charges. Each engagement cost the Iron Requiem little in men, but it consumed everything else: time, ammunition, and the irreplaceable focus of a space marine. For every cultist they killed, 2 more seemed to rise from the hive's endless depths, their faces blank with fanaticism. Brother Kalin, his presence quiet but his observations sharp, offered a more chilling interpretation. "They are not just trying to bleed us," he said, his eyes fixed on the hololith. "They are studying us. Every ambush, every trap. It is a test. They measure our response times, our tactical patterns, our weapon ranges. Someone is gathering data. Someone is learning how to kill us more efficiently." The observation hung in the air, more threatening than any body count. It was Sister Medici Iolanthe, her unaugmented form a stark contrast to the surrounding ceramite, who identified their most potent weapon. "They are using the civilian population as a shield," she stated, her voice steady despite the company. "Not by putting them in the line of fire. Psychologically. Every day this assault continues. Thousands of non-combatants die from the crossfire, from collapsing infrastructure, from simple, paralyzing terror. The rebels know you will not simply bombard hab blocks to get at them. Your restraint, your humanity, is the weapon they are using against you." Theron listened, absorbing each perspective. Vortigern's order echoed in his mind. Prove it is possible. Not just to win, but to conquer in a way that left something of value. If he resorted to indiscriminate slaughter, he would achieve a military victory and a strategic failure. He would have taken the hive, but lost the argument. He finally broke his silence. "Our strategy is flawed. We are fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with infinite resources. We will not win by killing more of them." He swept his hand across the hololith, the tactical icons blurring. "We will win by killing the right ones." His gaze settled on the assembled officers. "New priority. We are no longer engaging in territorial conquest. We are now conducting decapitation strikes. All intelligence assets are to be focused on one task: identifying the enemy's command structure. All combat operations will be designed to provoke them, to force their hand, to make them reveal themselves." He turned to Librarian Thayan, whose eyes glowed with a faint inner light. "The Chaos Presence. You said you could feel its influence. Can you trace it to its heart?" Thayan inclined his head. "The entity, or entities, it is skillful. It masks its signature within the hive's background psychic noise, but its influence ripples outward from a central point, like a stone cast in a pond. If I can get closer to the industrial district where the signal is strongest, I may be able to triangulate its source." "Then that is your mission," Theron commanded. "Take what support you require. Find the head of this serpent." As his officers dispersed to carry out their new orders, Theron allowed himself a moment of private reflection. Space Marines were not designed for this. They were not peacekeepers or occupiers. They were the Emperor's divine wrath, designed to annihilate his foes with overwhelming efficiency. To adapt to a war that rewarded patience over aggression, subtlety over force, required a philosophical shift. He wondered then if that was why the Iron Requiem had been chosen, not for their strength, but for their capacity to learn. The hunt for the rebellion's leadership became a hunt for ghosts. Space Marines, instruments of overwhelming confrontation, found themselves chasing whispers through the hive's labyrinthine guts. Scout Sergeant Varix led his squad through the stinking dark of the Underhive. Acting on intelligence from his mutant allies, each location they provided, a derelict manufactorum, a collapsed hab block, a forgotten shrine to some long-dead saint, bore the signs of recent occupation. The air still tasted of stale sweat and nervous energy, but the commanders were always gone, vanished moments before the Marines arrived. Someone was warning them. The rebellion's counterintelligence was a phantom, moving with a speed that defied logic. Frustrated, Varix abandoned the hunt for men and began hunting the system that moved them. He turned his squad's focus from individuals to infrastructure. It was grueling, tedious work, antithetical to the Astartes spirit of decisive action. For 3 days, they mapped the network of dead drops, tracing the flow of messages from one anonymous courier to the next. They watched from shadows as data slates were exchanged in crowded markets, as coded signals were chalked onto rusted bulkheads. Slowly, a pattern emerged, and with it, a deeply disturbing truth. Cross-referencing the network's physical locations with hive archives, Varix discovered that its foundations had been laid down more than 15 years ago. This was not a rebellion. This was an infestation, planned for a generation. At the same time, librarian Theon was conducting his own hunt, not through the physical world, but through the roiling chaos of the immaterium. He sat in a meditative trance in a secured chamber, his physical body guarded while his consciousness plunged into the warp. He followed the psychic signature of the Chaos Presence, a trail of cold malice that wound through the hive's collective soul. Each journey was a risk. The warp was not empty. Ancient things swam in its depths, things that hungered for the light of a psyker's mind. What he found was worse than any demon. The corruption was not a single entity residing in a specific place. It was something older, stranger. It had woven itself into the very bones of Hive Secundus. It existed in the ferrocrete of the foundations, in the hum of the power conduits, in the ancient, groaning machinery of the life support systems. It had become part of the Hive's ecosystem. Theon recoiled from the horrible elegance of the trap. The Chaos Presence had made itself essential. It was entwined with the systems that kept 2 billion souls alive. To attack it directly, to purge its physical anchors, would mean destroying the Hive's infrastructure. It would mean triggering a cascade of failures that would kill millions through asphyxiation, starvation, and exposure. Purging it meant committing genocide. Leaving it meant watching the entire world fall to damnation. He brought his findings to Theron. The first captain received the news with the stoicism of his rank, but the officers around him could not hide their shock. "We face an enemy that has become the city itself," Theron stated, his voice a low growl. "Conventional tactics, even our unconventional ones, cannot reach it without destroying what we came to save." Brother Kalen, present for the briefing, gave voice to the question that now filled the chamber. "Then, what do we do?" Theron was silent for a full minute, the weight of an impossible choice settling on him. "We do what Space Marines have always done when facing impossible odds," he finally said, his voice hard as iron. "We find another way, or we die trying." He turned from the hololith and activated his personal vox, requesting a private encrypted channel to the inevitable verdict. The experiment in Hive Secundus had produced its results. 100 Space Marines could achieve military dominance over a population of billions. But that dominance was a hollow thing if the true enemy could not be fought with bolter and blade. Something more was needed, something the Codex Astartes had never imagined. Chapter Master Vortigern's voice came across the link, clear and steady. Theron relayed the situation, ending his report with the stark conclusion. Vortigern listened without interruption. When Theron finished, the chapter master's decision was immediate and absolute. Hold your position. I am sending reinforcements, but not the kind you expect. A lone shuttle, sleek and black as obsidian, descended through the contested airspace of Hive Secundus. Its flight path was clear, its transponder broadcasting codes that made rebel gun crews hesitate, their fingers frozen on triggers. On the bridge of the Righteous Conviction, the strike cruiser's command crew watched its approach on the main PIC display, their professional calm fracturing into murmurs of uncertainty. Against the shuttle's matte black hull, a single symbol gleamed with stark authority, the stylized eye of the inquisitorial rosette. Inquisitor Vashti Morn arrived at First Captain Theron's command post without ceremony. She was a small woman by any standard, swallowed by a greatcoat of hardened leather, but she moved with a purpose that drew all eyes. Flanking her were not Imperial soldiers, but the instruments of her office. On her right, a death cult assassin, its face a mask of scar tissue and augmetics, its lithe body containing more metal than flesh. On her left, a savant, twitching and muttering, his mind a living cogitator hard-linked to a dozen data slates that hovered around him on grav repulsors. Behind them, chained and hooded, shuffled a sanctioned psyker, his every movement a testament to the terrible power held in check by the bonds of his office. The meeting began with a tension thick enough to taste. The Adeptus Astartes and the Holy Ordos of the Inquisition were allies in name, but rivals in practice. Their relationship a 10,000-year history of suspicion and jurisdiction disputes. Theron, a giant of gene-forged muscle and ceramite, saw a meddler who lacked the strength to fight her own battles. Morn, her eyes ancient and weary, saw a blunt instrument, magnificent in its power but incapable of the sophisticated work true victory required. Vortigern had summoned her. That was the only reason Theron had granted this audience. "Your forces fight with admirable ferocity, First Captain," Morn began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, "and you are losing this war because of it." She gestured, and her savant caused the hololithic tactical table to flicker. Theron's display of military positions was replaced with a cascade of documents, gene scans, and archaeological records. Carthax Prime was tainted before the first Imperial colonists ever set foot here, she explained, her finger tracing a line of ancient script. The world's original settlers, fleeing the horrors of old night, made bargains with powers they did not understand. The Carthax Covenant your tech marines found was not a treaty. It was a contract with an entity from the deep warp. In exchange for protection and prosperity, the colonists agreed to conditions. The nature of those conditions became sickeningly clear as Morn's data stream continued. "The entity feeds," she said, her voice dropping, "not on flesh, but on psychic energy. Specifically, the energy generated by mass, concentrated suffering. Wars, plagues, famines, any source of refined anguish sustains it. The rebellion is not a revolution, Captain. It is a harvest, cultivated for decades to produce the maximum yield of despair." Theron processed the information, his tactical mind racing to connect it to the facts on the ground. The rebellion generates suffering through conflict, while freeing the planet from Imperial control so the entity can resume its preferred methods. "Precisely," Morn confirmed, "and your assault has accelerated the timeline. Every one of your victories, every rebel you kill, produces waves of terror and grief. You are fighting an unwinnable war, because your very success is what strengthens the true enemy. The revelation landed in the command post like a shell, shattering the foundation of their entire strategy. They were not warriors. They were farmhands, reaping a harvest of pain for a monstrous, unseen master. Morn offered the only alternative. The entity is not invincible. It is bound to this world through physical anchor points. Find them, sever them simultaneously, and its connection to real space will be broken. It cannot be killed, not by us, but it can be banished. Its influence will fade. The population's conditioning will break. The rebellion will collapse. She looked from her own strange retinue to the assembled space marines. Your brothers can fight their way to the anchors. My assets can perform the severance rituals. Together, we might actually save this world. Theron considered the offer. To trust an inquisitor was to invite betrayal. Their kind were notorious for sacrificing allies to achieve their aims, but her logic was undeniable. The evidence was absolute. He had no other path. "We will cooperate," Theron said, his voice a low rumble of barely contained violence. "But understand this, Inquisitor. My brothers' lives are not expendable currency for your schemes. Betray us, and no force in this galaxy will protect you from my wrath." Inquisitor Morn's intelligence painted a map of calculated malice on the hololithic display. 7 points of light glowed within the schematic of Hive Secundus, each marking an anchor where the warp entity's influence bled into real space. The entity's cunning was absolute. Each anchor was not a hidden shrine or a secret coven, but a piece of critical infrastructure, a system upon which millions of lives depended for their daily survival. The monster had woven itself into the city's life support. First, Captain Theron divided his remaining 84 combat-effective Marines into 7 strike teams. The plan was as elegant as it was desperate, a synchronized assault. Any delay, any failure to strike at the same moment, would allow the entity to shunt power from one anchor to another, reinforcing the threatened position. The planning session detailed the unique horrors of each objective. Anchor Alpha was located in the primary water processing plant, a massive subterranean facility directly beneath an artificial lake that served as the Hive's emergency reservoir. The ancient containment systems groaned under the pressure of billions of tons of water. Any significant combat, any stray explosive, risked a breach that would unleash a cataclysmic flood, drowning millions in the lower levels without warning. Anchor Beta occupied the heart of a fusion reactor complex, its plasma core a captive star that powered 17 HAB districts. Destroying the anchor without damaging the reactor's containment field was a task of surgical precision. Failure would trigger a cascading power collapse, plunging entire cities within the city into darkness, silence, and death. Anchor Gamma presented a moral nightmare. It was embedded within a sprawling medici facility that housed 500,000 patients. The rebels had fortified the position, their guns positioned behind beds, their firing lanes crossing wards filled with the sick and dying. They were betting on the Astartes' unwillingness to slaughter the helpless to reach their objective. Theron assigned his assets with cold pragmatism. Sergeant Helvain's Terminators, with their heavy, resilient armor, were assigned to Anchor Delta, a hazardous manufacturing complex where industrial dangers were as much a threat as the enemy. To Anchor Gamma, the hospital, he assigned Brother Kalen's tactical squad. Kalen's unconventional empathy, his unnerving ability to think like a mortal, might be the key to navigating the labyrinth of human shields. It was then that Sister Medici Iolanthe stepped forward. "First, Captain, I request assignment to Sergeant Kalen's team. Theron's gaze fell upon the mortal woman. It was a suicidal request. Your skills are more valuable in the rear, treating our wounded. My skills are in medicine, Captain, she countered, her voice steady. I can distinguish a genuine patient from a disguised combatant. I can help save those who can be saved. Let me serve. Theron hesitated, the thought of sending a non-Astartes into the heart of the assault grating against his protective instincts. But he recognized the tactical truth in her words. He gave a single, sharp nod of approval. The operation's timeline was set. 36 hours to infiltrate and position all 7 teams. The synchronized assault would commence at local midnight, when rebel activity was at its lowest. During that time, Inquisitor Morn's sanctioned psyker, protected by a squad of Theron's own veterans, would begin the severance ritual from a central, secured nexus. Scout Sergeant Verix, his face young but his eyes ancient, broke the silence. The entity has had 10,000 years to prepare for this. It knows we are coming. What is our contingency when the plan fails? Theron's scarred face was unreadable. He met the scout's gaze, and his voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, carrying the weight of ultimate authority. If this assault fails, I will signal Chapter Master Vortigern. He will initiate exterminatus. Carthax Prime will burn, and the entity will be denied its prize. Victory or annihilation, Sergeant. There is no middle ground. A profound stillness settled over the command post. The fate of 19 billion souls now rested on the success of 7 small squads. The teams departed, melting into the shadows of the hive. The clock began to count down. Brother Kalen's team moved through the guts of Hive Secundus. The maintenance tunnels leading to Anchor Gamma were unmonitored, just as Inquisitor Morn's intelligence had promised. They were also tight, dark, and slick with generations of condensed filth. The air, a foul cocktail of ozone and decay, clung to their ceramite armor. 8 tactical marines and 1 mortal woman advanced in near-total silence, the weight of 500,000 civilian lives a palpable pressure in the cramped space. The Medici facility sprawled across 12 levels. According to the data, emergency trauma wards occupied the lower floors, with chronic care filling the middle. The Chaos Anchor was said to be nested in the administrative levels above, defiling an ancient shrine to the God Emperor that predated the rebellion. Kalen split his small force. 5 Marines would secure the lower access points, a bulwark against any rebel reinforcements. 2 others would advance directly toward the anchor, a loud, visible threat to draw the enemy's attention. Kalen himself, with Sister Medici Iolanthe at his side, would take the quiet path, infiltrating through the chronic care levels. What they found there was not a hospital, but a slaughterhouse in slow motion. The patients in the long, sterile wards were not being treated. They were being harvested. Rebel medics, their movements devoid of compassion, attended to machinery that had nothing to do with healing. Translucent tubes snaked from the arms and spines of listless figures, siphoning blood, spinal fluid, and other vital humors. The extracted fluids flowed through a network of conduits, pumped upward toward the higher levels, feeding something that hungered. Iolanthe stopped, her face pale in the dim light. She recognized the setup from forbidden inquisitorial texts she had only ever seen in redacted summaries. "They're not shields," she whispered, her voice trembling with horror. "They are fuel. This is a psychic amplifier. They are concentrating mass suffering and directing it, making the anchor stronger." The tactical calculus shifted into something monstrous. Destroying the anchor was not enough. The amplifier itself had to be disabled. but it was powered by thousands of living, breathing souls. Kalen's mind raced. He opened a secured Vox channel. First Captain, the situation is more complex than anticipated. Request guidance. Theron's response was immediate, cold, and absolute. The mission parameters remain unchanged. Destroy the anchor by any means necessary. Kalen terminated the link. Understood. He turned to Iolanthe, his helmet's auto-senses hiding the conflict in his eyes. Is there any way to disconnect them from this machine without killing them? Iolanthe's gaze swept the room, her trained mind processing the horrific infrastructure. Perhaps. The system is designed for living subjects. The dead provide no psychic output. If we could induce unconsciousness across the entire facility, all at once, the amplifier might lose coherence. It might break the circuit long enough for us to neutralize the anchor separately. The plan was a prayer whispered in a hurricane, fragile and dependent on a dozen variables they couldn't control. But it was an alternative to butchery. Kalen made his choice. We modify the operation, he declared. Primary objective, neutralize the amplifier. Secondary objective, destroy the anchor. Civilian casualties will be minimized to mission-critical requirements. One of his brothers, Varketh, stepped forward. Sergeant, that is not what the first captain ordered. The first captain ordered us to destroy the anchor by any means necessary. Kalen's voice was a low growl of conviction. This is necessary. If we cannot save the Imperium's citizens while defending them, we are no different than the monsters we fight. He accepted the risks. The new plan would take more time, exposing them all to greater danger. He dispatched Varketh to the facility's primary atmospheric processing systems, a location Iolanthe had identified on a stolen schematic. His orders were to introduce a specific sedative compound into the air supply, a surgical anesthetic that would render the hive's human population unconscious, but to which a space marine's augmented physiology was entirely immune. As Varketh moved to execute his new, insubordinate task, the facility's passive sensors finally registered their presence. Alarms, shrill and piercing, screamed through the corridors. The race had begun. Kalen advanced toward the upper levels, bolt pistol raised in one hand, combat knife in the other, offering a silent prayer to the Emperor that his compassion would not be the death of them all. Anchor Beta was a problem that could not be solved with compassion. It was a knot of plasteel and adamantium that could only be untangled with violence. Brother Sergeant Talos led his assault team through access corridors built to survive a reactor meltdown. The walls were meters thick, lined with conduits humming with contained power. The doors, heavy blast shields sealed with magnetic locks, required shaped demolition charges just to breach. Every meter of their advance cost them time and precious, irreplaceable resources. The rebels had turned the fusion complex into a death trap. Automated defense turrets, stripped from fallen Imperial Guard vehicles, covered every junction with overlapping fields of fire. Mining charges were wired into critical systems, poised to trigger a cascading power failure that would plunge a dozen Hab districts into darkness. And somewhere in the reactor's heart, a cultist cell of true believers maintained the anchor that bound the warp entity to this world. Taelos was not a subtle warrior. His 2 centuries of service had taught him that superior firepower, applied without hesitation, solved most problems. But here, his preferred methods were a suicide pact. A single stray bolt round in the wrong place, a misthrown crack grenade, could rupture a coolant line and trigger the very catastrophe Inquisitor Morn had warned of. Suppressed weapons only. Taelos ordered, his voice a low growl of disgust through the squad vox. Combat knives for close work. No explosives, no plasma, no flamers. He fixed his gaze on the squad's heavy weapons specialist. Brother Corvain, that heavy bolter stays holstered. I will not have this section of the hive turned into a miniature sun. You do not fire unless I give the specific authorization. Corvain acknowledged with a single click of his vox. A heavy weapons specialist without his weapon was a priest without his faith. Technically functional, but fundamentally incomplete. The advance became an exercise in controlled brutality. They engaged rebel defenders with bolt pistols firing subsonic rounds that hissed through the air before punching through flesh and bone with a sickening wet thud. The fighting was intimate, ugly, and suffocatingly close. At the third junction, they found their path blocked by a single rebel, his hand clutching a dead man's switch wired to a massive mining charge. His eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and absolute conviction. He screamed something about freedom as Taelos advanced. "You cannot threaten me with death, traitor." Talos's voice was as cold as the void. "I embraced it centuries ago." He moved with a speed that mortal eyes could not follow. His combat knife, which had tasted the blood of orcs and Eldar on a dozen worlds, flashed out, severing the rebel's forearm at the wrist. The hand fell, its grip slackening. The charge remained inert. The man bled out on the grated floor in seconds. Deeper in, the chaos taint became manifest. Industrial servitors, once consecrated to the Omnissiah's service, now shambled through the corridors, their flesh fused with corrupted machinery in a blasphemous union of man and monster. Heavy equipment had been rearranged into geometric patterns that hurt the eye to follow, angles and curves that violated the laws of three-dimensional space. Taelos recognized the signature. This was the work of the Dark Mechanicum, techno-heretics who twisted the machine god's sacred creations to serve the great enemy. Their presence meant this anchor was far more significant than the others. "First, Captain," Taelos commanded into his vox, his tone sharpened with new urgency. "Anchor Beta shows signs of Dark Mechanicum infestation. This may be the linchpin. If we take this position, the others might collapse." Theron's response was immediate. "Acknowledged. Prioritize Beta's destruction. All other teams will accelerate their timelines to match yours." The order lit a fire under Taelos. He pushed his squad harder, the pace becoming a relentless grinding advance. They were running out of time, running out of subsonic ammunition, running out of brothers. 2 Marines were down, their gene seed recovered by the squad's apothecary. But the anchor chamber was close. Taelos could feel its wrongness through his armor's sensors, a spike in radiation that had nothing to do with fusion physics. "Final approach," Taelos announced, his squad stacking up on the final blast door. "Whatever waits inside, we end this now." His boot connected with the door's release mechanism as his Marines prepared to pour through. The heavy adamantium slid open, revealing horrors that even their centuries of conditioning and psycho-indoctrination struggled to process. Anchor Alpha presented its own unique nightmare. Brother Sergeant Malachi's team reached the water processing plant to find the rebels had prepared defenses that weaponized the environment itself. The plant occupied a vast cavern carved from bedrock deep beneath Hive Secundus. Directly above it, held back by ancient groaning mechanisms, sat an artificial reservoir containing enough water to supply the entire hive for 3 months. The rebels had wired those mechanisms with explosive charges. Any significant combat, any stray round, risked triggering a catastrophic flood that would drown not just the Marines, but millions of civilians in the hive's lower levels. Malachi assessed the situation with a grim pragmatism that had seen him through 100 campaigns. "They've given us a choice: surrender or murder millions," he stated through the squad vox. "They misunderstand what we are." But the choice was not so simple. His orders were to destroy the anchor, and the anchor sat at the plant's exact center, directly beneath the reservoir's primary containment seal. Reaching it without triggering the flood was a tactical impossibility. Scout sniper Pyrrhus, a young warrior attached to Malachi's team for reconnaissance, offered an alternative. "Sergeant, the reservoir's overflow channels. They connect to the plant's tertiary systems. If we can access them from outside the plant, we might reach the anchor without entering the main defended areas." The plan required swimming through water purification pipes, barely wide enough for an unarmored man. It was impossible for a space marine in full battle plate. Pyrrhus volunteered to go alone, stripped down to his body glove, carrying only a combat knife and a satchel of demolition charges. Malachi refused. "Scouts are not expendable. Your gene seed is as valuable as any battle brother's." "My gene seed serves the chapter whether I live or die," Pyrrhus countered, his voice steady with the fearlessness of youth. "What serves the chapter now is completing this mission. I can do this. Let me prove it." The journey was a descent into a hell of cold steel and crushing darkness. The pipes were cramped, their surfaces slick with corroded metal and foul sediment. Pyrrhus moved through the near-total blackness, guided only by his enhanced senses. Things that had evolved in the dark over millennia, blind creatures of tooth and claw, reacted to his warmth and movement with predatory instinct. He killed 3 with his knife, the close-quarters struggles silent and brutal, before he finally reached the reservoir's central chamber. Inside, he found the anchor. It was a structure of impossible geometry that seemed to grow from the bedrock itself, pulsing with a sick light that existed in no natural spectrum. Guarding it were 3 cultists who had merged their bodies with the machinery, their flesh flowing into pipes and conduits like organic components in a blasphemous machine. Pyrrhus struck before they could react, his blade finding throats and hearts with practiced, lethal precision. One cultist survived long enough to gurgle a final heresy. "You cannot destroy what was here before your corpse emperor drew breath. We are eternal. We are necessary." The scout ignored the words and planted his demolition charges. He knew the blast radius in this confined space offered no chance of escape. He was a dead man. He activated his vox, his breathing steady. "Sergeant Malachi, charges are set, awaiting your order to detonate." A pause stretched across the vox, thick with unspoken weight. "Pyrrhus?" Malachi's voice was heavy with an emotion he rarely showed. "Your service honors the chapter. The chapter honors me with this service, for the Emperor." The charges detonated. The anchor shattered in a silent, blinding flash. And somewhere in the explosion's aftermath, Pyrrhus's vital signs ceased transmitting. Malachi received the confirmation through his helmet display and offered a moment of silence, all the ritual a space marine's death required in combat. The mission continued. Anchor Alpha was destroyed, its destruction achieved through sacrifice rather than force. The water remained contained. Millions of civilians would never know how close they came to drowning or who had died to save them. The synchronized assault, a plan of elegant clockwork precision, shattered into chaos within the first 10 minutes. On the hololithic display in his command post, First Captain Theron watched the status icons for his 7 teams flicker from green to amber, then to a cascade of blood red. The operation was failing, Anchor Beta's complications had delayed Talus's team. At Anchor Gamma, Kalen's modified, compassionate strategy had thrown his timeline off by critical minutes. Malachi's success at Anchor Alpha had come at the cost of his scout, leaving his team undermanned and struggling to reach their next objective. The Vox crackled with the dissonant chorus of a battle unraveling. Anchor Delta reports success, his communications officer announced. Sergeant Helvane confirms target destroyed. 3 casualties, all recoverable. A moment of relief, immediately erased by the next report. Anchor Epsilon has encountered heavy resistance. Sergeant Crovus requests immediate fire support. Then another. Anchor Zeta team is pinned. Their position is untenable. Sergeant Malachi is diverted to provide reinforcement, but is still 12 minutes out. The dominoes were falling. If even one anchor survived, the entity would retain its connection to real space. Every sacrifice, Pyrrhus's death, the losses at the reactor, the brothers bleeding out at Zeta, would be for nothing. Theron made the command decision that defined his leadership. He would not salvage the plan. He would break it further to save it. "Commit the reserve," he ordered, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "All 20! Deploy now!" Thunderhawks screamed from their launch bays, plunging into airspace thick with anti-aircraft fire. The reserves reached Anchor Epsilon, just as Sergeant Crovus's position was about to be overrun. They descended like a mailed fist, breaking the defensive cordon and scattering the cultists. Crovus led the final desperate push into the anchor chamber, his power sword carving through the last defenders, while his marines planted their charges. The anchor died in fire and faith. At Anchor Zeta, the situation was even more dire. The rebels had collapsed access tunnels, trapping the assault team in a kill zone. When relief forces finally broke through, they found the defenders fighting hand-to-hand, their bolters empty, their combat knives slick with gore, ceramite armor standing over a pile of enemy dead. But at Anchor Gamma, the climax was not one of violence, but of silence. The sedative compound flooded the facility's atmosphere systems. Patients collapsed into deep, harmless unconsciousness. The rebel defenders, lacking the Space Marines' enhanced resistance, succumbed seconds later. Kalen advanced through corridors of sleeping bodies, Sister Iolanthe moving alongside him, checking vital signs as they passed. The psychic amplifier, its living power source now silent. Lost coherence. Deprived of reinforcement, the anchor became vulnerable. "Now!" Kalen commanded. His Marines placed their charges with surgical precision. The explosion was contained, destroying the anchor without touching the surrounding infrastructure. Hundreds of patients would wake up confused, but alive. As the final anchor fell, Inquisitor Morn completed her ritual. At the central location, Theron's Marines had secured, her sanctioned psyker screamed, a sound of pure agony as reality tore around him, his body a conduit for energies that burned soul and flesh alike. The entity, ancient, patient, and impossibly old, shrieked through dimensions humans could not perceive. And then, silence. Theron felt it before his instruments confirmed it. A weight lifted from the hive, a pressure so constant that no one had noticed it until its absence left a hollow void. Across Hive Secundus, citizens paused in confusion, their psychic conditioning broken, their manufactured hatred evaporating like morning mist. "The entity is banished," Morn reported through the Vox, her voice exhausted but triumphant. "Its influence will return, eventually. We have bought years, perhaps decades." Theron surveyed the tactical display, now a sea of green where red had once dominated. 7 anchors destroyed, 16 Space Marines dead. and somehow, against all probability, Hive Secundus was still standing. "Phase 1 complete," he announced, his voice a cold, hard line of command. "Begin Phase 2, pacification of remaining resistance." The rebellion did not die in fire or fury. It evaporated like a fever dream. The psychic pressure that had saturated Hive Secundus for years, a constant, grinding weight of amplified hatred and fanatical purpose, was simply gone. In its absence, a profound silence descended, not of sound, but of soul. For millions of rebels, it was like waking from a trance, the world snapping back into a focus they hadn't realized was missing. The rage that had burned in their blood now felt like a cold, distant memory. Brother Kalen witnessed the transformation as his team secured the Medici facility's lower levels. Rebels who had fought with suicidal determination mere hours ago now dropped their weapons at the first sight of ceramite armor. They didn't flee in terror. They simply stopped, their faces masks of bewilderment. He cornered one, a woman whose hands bore the thick calluses of manufacturum labor, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with him. "What did you believe you were fighting for?" Kalen asked, his voice a low rumble through his helm's Vox grill. She struggled, her brow furrowed in genuine effort. "Freedom," she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "We wanted freedom from the oppression." It felt so real, so immediate, a fire in my head. She looked at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Now it just feels distant. Like a story someone told me long ago. Reports from across the Hive confirmed the phenomenon. Organized resistance collapsed into disorganized crowds. Entire rebel units dissolved, their members abandoning weapon caches and fortified positions to wander back toward hab blocks they hadn't seen in months. The rebellion's military structure, built on a foundation of psychic conditioning, had crumbled from within. But not all were so easily pacified. The true believers, the core leadership who had knowingly bargained with the entity and embraced its gifts, felt the psychic silence not as release, but as amputation. They understood what had happened. Their god had been wounded, driven away. Their response was not confusion, but cold, calculated survival. They melted into the Hive's shadows, their dedication absolute, their hatred now their own. Inquisitor Morn, her own psyker still recovering from the ritual, identified this remnant through the fading echoes in the warp. "Perhaps 3,000 hardcore cultists remain," she informed First Captain Theron. "They have gone to ground. They will wait for the entity to return, and they will be the seeds of its new garden. If we don't eliminate them now, this victory is temporary." Theron studied the tactical display, his forces depleted. He had 32 battle brothers combat effective, with another dozen recovering from grievous wounds. Hunting 3,000 dedicated fanatics through a city of billions was an impossibility. It was an operation for an entire Imperial Guard army, not a shattered Space Marine strike force. "We need local assets," Theron concluded, his mind processing the impossible arithmetic. "Citizens who have reason to hate the rebellion and the knowledge to identify its true adherents." The solution emerged from the depths. Scout Sergeant Verix reported an encounter at the edge of the Underhive. The mutants he had allied with were drawn to the surface by the psychic quiet, an absence of a pressure they had lived under their entire lives. Their leader, a creature whose twisted spine and elongated limbs belied a sharp, predatory intelligence, approached Verix with an offer. "We know the deep places," it rasped, its voice a wet, clicking sound. "We know who went there to whisper to dark things. Give us permission to hunt. We will bring you their heads." Verix relayed the offer. The alliance was a violation of a dozen imperial laws. Mutants were abhumans, fit only for servitude or extermination. But the doctrine that condemned them also permitted temporary alliances against a greater threat. Theron's pragmatism overrode his doctrinal purity. "You have 48 hours," he transmitted to the mutant leader through Varix. "After that, you will return to your tunnels, and this agreement will be forgotten. The Inquisitor will ensure your compliance." The mutants vanished back into the darkness they called home. Within hours, the purge began. Bodies started appearing in the gloom of alleyways and the filth of drainage conduits. Cultists dragged from their hiding places, their throats cut with crude, effective blades. The mutants held grudges that spanned generations and knew the hive's secret ways better than any surface dweller. By the end of the second day, the cultist remnant was broken. A few had escaped to other hives, but most had paid for their faith in blood. Hive Secundus was finally, truly, conquered. The victory was complete, achieved not by Space Marine strength alone, but through the weaponization of allies the Imperium would have otherwise destroyed. Chapter Master Vortigern's golden aquila gleamed against armor still stained with the smoke of Hive Septimus. He descended to Hive Secundus personally, his Thunderhawk setting down in a plaza that had been a kill zone only days before. He walked through streets still littered with the debris of combat, past citizens who bowed their heads in an automatic, reflexive deference to the symbol of imperial authority. The rebellion had been broken here. Now, the chapter master needed to understand precisely what the Iron Requiem had learned from the breaking. He convened the survivors in the cleared assembly hall of a hab block, the air thick with the scent of ozone and sanctified oils. First Captain Theron stood before him, his remaining force arrayed in silent ranks behind him. The numbers, when Theron delivered them, were a brutal accounting. Total casualties for Operation Secundus: 47 battle brothers killed or missing, presumed dead. Nearly half of the experimental force gone. By any conventional military standard, it was a catastrophic loss rate, an operational failure. But Vortigern's gaze swept over the hall, seeing not just the empty spaces in the ranks, but the living city beyond the walls. He heard the hum of restored power, the distant clang of manufactorum work resuming. "You have achieved something unprecedented," Vortigern's voice rumbled, filling the hall. "You conquered a hive of billions with 100 space marines, and you preserved its productive capacity. The Administratum's tithe collectors will find a functioning world, not a graveyard of resentful slaves." Theron accepted the assessment with the stoicism of his rank. "We also revealed profound weaknesses in our doctrine. The Codex Astartes provides no guidance for this kind of operation. We improvised constantly. Improvisation cost lives." "Improvisation always costs lives," Vortigern stated. "The question is whether the cost is sustainable." He turned his attention to the assembled survivors, his eyes seeming to meet each warrior's gaze. "You have proven what I suspected, that Space Marines can accomplish more than mere destruction. But proving a concept is not the same as perfecting it. We have 7 hive cities remaining on this world, each presenting unique challenges. What you learned here must be refined, documented, and transmitted to your brothers." The debriefing began, an hours-long dissection of the campaign. Each squad leader reported their experiences, their innovations, and their failures. Patterns emerged from the litany of combat reports: the critical value of local intelligence assets, the force-multiplying effect of psychological operations, the tactical necessity of understanding an enemy's motivation rather than merely their capability. Brother Kalin's operation at the Medicae facility drew particular attention. His decision to prioritize civilian survival, to deviate from the primary objective in favor of a more complex, compassionate approach, was a flagrant violation of operational security and direct orders. Vortigern called him forward and questioned him directly before the entire assembly. You risked mission failure to save mortal lives who meant nothing to the chapter's objectives. Vortigern's voice was cold, analytical. Explain your reasoning. Kalin stood at attention, his helmet removed, his gaze steady. The Imperium teaches that humanity is the Emperor's most precious resource. We are his instruments, forged to protect that resource. If we destroy what we are sworn to protect, we become indistinguishable from the monsters we fight. And if your compassion had caused the anchor to hold? If the entity had retained its grip because you moved too slowly? Then I would have accepted the consequences of my failure, Kalin answered without hesitation. But the Emperor granted us enhanced minds as well as enhanced bodies. We are capable of finding solutions that preserve both mission and morality. To accept the false choice between them is to admit defeat before the battle has even begun. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Vortigern held Kalin's gaze for a long, unreadable moment. Then he spoke. You will be promoted to sergeant. Your approach, unorthodox as it is, represents a capability the chapter requires. Teach your brothers what you know. The chapter master turned back to the assembled force, his decision made, the new path chosen. He outlined the next phase of the Carthax Prime campaign. The proof of concept had succeeded. Now came the full implementation. Conquering an entire world with fewer than 800 space marines. We have demonstrated that it can be done, Vortigern announced, his voice a clarion call. Now we must demonstrate that it can be done repeatedly. Prepare for planetary operations. The galaxy watches, whether it knows it or not. The conquest of Hive Secundus had been a victory. But the price was etched in blood-red numerals on the Strategium's main display. 47 casualties from a force of 100. A 47% loss rate. Chapter Master Vortigern stared at the numbers. The cold arithmetic of his campaign laid bare. To repeat that operation across the 7 remaining major hives was not a strategy. It was a guarantee of the Iron Requiem's functional destruction. The chapter would bleed out long before Carthax Prime submitted. A new way was required. His solution transformed the very foundation of the campaign. He would not treat each hive as a separate, isolated war. Instead, he envisioned a cascading conquest, a wave of submission that would build upon itself. Each conquered city would become a weapon to be used against the next, providing resources that would reduce the cost of every subsequent operation. Intelligence, local allies, and the crushing psychological momentum of Imperial victory would do what bolters and chainswords alone could not. Hive Tertius was the first test. Its spires were already trembling with rumors, carried by a stream of refugees fleeing the fighting in Secundus. They brought stories of the Angels of Death, of the entity's banishment, of Imperial order being restored. The rebellion's grip on the city's heart was weakening before the first Marine even deployed. Vortigern committed only 50 battle brothers to the assault, a force that would have been suicidal just weeks prior. They were supplemented by something new, something controversial. A 5,000-strong militia force, raised from the pacified population of Secundus. They were not warriors, not by Astartes standards, but they could hold ground, process prisoners, and manage supply lines, freeing the Space Marines to be the tip of the spear. The very existence of such a force skirted the edges of ancient prohibitions. The Codex Astartes discouraged chapters from maintaining large auxiliary forces, a lesson written in the blood of the Horus heresy. Inquisitor Morn, however, provided the necessary political cover. They operate under my authority. Chapter Master, not yours, she had stated, a thin, knowing smile on her lips. Technically, you are simply cooperating with assets I have independently developed. The distinction will matter to those who review our reports. Hive Tertius fell in 6 days. The rebel leadership, deprived of the entity's psychic reinforcement, shattered at the first sight of ceramite armor. Most of their fighters threw down their arms and surrendered. The Iron Requiem's casualties were 8 killed and 12 wounded. The cascading strategy worked. The pattern repeated, with variations. Hive Quartus resisted with the ferocity of the damned. Its governor had embraced chaos not for power, but from true conviction, and he fought to the death rather than face imperial justice. The fighting was heavier, but even his fanaticism could not stand against 40 determined space marines applying the hard-won lessons of Secundus. By the time the Iron Requiem fleet appeared in the skies above Hive Quintus, the war for that city was already over. Witnessing 4 of its sister hives fall to the angels of death, its population chose submission. A delegation of its highest-ranking civic leaders met Vortigern's shuttle under a flag of truce, negotiating terms of surrender on the landing pad. Vortigern accepted, his conditions ensuring their absolute cooperation with the Imperial Restoration. The Iron Requiem was perfecting a new art of war. It was a brutal, systematic process. Identify local influence structures, surgically neutralize chaos elements, and co-opt the remaining leadership through a precisely calibrated mixture of terror and incentive. It was not gentle, nor was it entirely just, but it preserved lives, both human and Astartes, that would otherwise have been ground into dust. Chief Librarian Malvox observed the transformation with an analytical eye. "We are becoming something the Codex never anticipated," he remarked to Vortigern. "Occupation specialists, warriors who conquer not through destruction, but through conversion." Vortigern acknowledged the observation without committing to its philosophical weight. "We are adapting to circumstance. Whether that adaptation becomes doctrine depends on factors beyond this campaign." But privately, in the quiet hours aboard the inevitable verdict, he had already begun composing supplements to the chapter's sacred texts, tactical analyses, and procedural guidelines that captured the lessons of Carthax Prime. The easy conquests, however, were at an end. As the last pockets of resistance in the equatorial plains were being pacified, new reconnaissance data arrived. It was from the planet's 7th, final, and most isolated city, Hive Septimus. The data scrolls painted a picture not of a city in rebellion, but of a dedicated fortress. The news spread through the command staff like a winter chill. The final battle for Carthax Prime would test everything they had learned, and everything they had become. Hive Septimus rose from the glacial bedrock of Carthax Prime's polar continent, its black towers like the teeth of some long-dead leviathan gnawing at a sky of perpetual twilight. 3 years of rebellion had not just fortified it, they had transformed it. This was not a city, it was a sanctuary of damnation. Chapter Master Vortigern reviewed the reconnaissance data, his face a mask of stone as the hololith displayed the Hive's preparations. Anti-orbital weapon batteries, ancient and powerful enough to tear a strike cruiser from the void. Glimmering energy shields, drawing their impossible strength from reactors deliberately corrupted by tech heresy. And at the Hive's heart, a presence that was not a presence at all. His librarians could not identify it, their psychic scans registering only a void, a perfect and unnatural absence where something vast and terrible should be. "They've summoned something," Chief Librarian Malvox concluded, his voice a low rumble that barely concealed his disquiet. "Or they are in the process of summoning it. The ritual is incomplete, but its foundations are already laid." The implications were absolute. If that ritual reached its conclusion, Hive Septimus would become a gate, a permanent tear in the fabric of reality through which the forces of chaos could pour without end. The threat was no longer to Carthax Prime, but to the entire subsector. Vortigern weighed his options. A direct assault against such prepared defenses would be a bloodbath, potentially catastrophic. But every moment of delay allowed the summoning to creep closer to completion. There was no good choice, only the less terrible ones. He convened a final council of war, gathering his senior officers and Inquisitor Morn in the strategium of the inevitable verdict. The debate that followed laid bare the fractures in their philosophies of war. First, Captain Theron, ever the pragmatist of overwhelming force, spoke first. "We commit everything," he stated, his fist clenching on the hololithic table's rim. "Every remaining Marine, every gunship, every mortal auxiliary. We break their defenses through sheer, unrelenting pressure, and accept whatever losses that requires. It is the only certain way." Inquisitor Morn offered a blade, where Theron offered a hammer. The summoning is a ritual. It requires specific conditions, specific incantations, specific focuses. If we can disrupt those conditions through assassination of their key sorcerers, destruction of ritual artifacts, or simply by sowing chaos among their preparations, we might prevent its completion without a frontal assault. Master of the Forge, Caelius saw the problem as a machine to be dismantled. The Hive's shields draw power from centralized sources. If my tech Marines can identify and destroy those sources, the shields will fall. The Hive becomes vulnerable. The question is whether we can reach those generators through defended territory. Then a new voice, invited to the council despite his relatively junior rank, offered a path no one else had considered. Brother Sergeant Kalen, his promotion earned in the Medici facility of Hive Secundus, gestured to the population schematics. The Hive's citizens are not all true believers. Millions serve chaos through fear, not devotion. What if we gave them a reason to hope? An internal rebellion, rising from within, while we assault from without. Vortigern listened to each proposal, his gaze fixed on the rotating globe of Carthax Prime. He saw the merit in each, the weakness in each. And in the silence that followed, he saw the solution. It was not one plan, but all of them. He would not choose a single path. He would forge a new one from their synthesis, an operation more complex and more dangerous than anything the Iron Requiem had ever attempted. "We will not choose one axis of attack," Vortigern announced, his voice cutting through the chamber's tension. "We will attack on 4 simultaneously." He manipulated the display, highlighting targets across the Hive. Infiltration teams will disrupt the ritual. Technical teams will target the shield generators. Psychological operations will incite internal resistance, and our main assault force will apply pressure so great that their defenders cannot concentrate against any single threat. Each element supports the others. None can succeed alone. Together, they will crack Hive Septimus like an egg. The planning consumed 3 days. When the final briefing concluded, Vortigern addressed his Chapter 1 last time before deployment. "We have conquered 6 hives with methods the Imperium has never seen. The seventh will be conquered with methods we have not yet imagined. The Emperor protects, but he expects us to deserve his protection through faith, courage, and intellect. Prove worthy. Prove that Space Marines are more than weapons. Prove that we are humanity's finest expression. Scout Sergeant Verix led his team of 7 through a world of white knives. The Arctic winds of Hive Septimus's polar continent would have frozen mortal flesh solid in seconds. The storms of blinding fury that defeated augur arrays and buried tracks within minutes. But Space Marines were not mortals. Their enhanced physiology, regulated by their black carapace, allowed them to move through this frozen hell like ghosts. Specialized cloaks bled their heat signatures into the howling blizzard, and their movements were timed to the chaotic rhythms of weather patterns that left defender sensors blind and deaf. They were specters in a land of ice, their objective buried deep in the Hive's corrupt heart. Their point of entry was a nightmare. Massive pipes, kilometers in diameter, carried the refuse of millions from the Hive's core to treatment facilities at its edge. Verix and his scouts slipped into the outflow, descending into a torrent of toxic chemicals and biological waste. The stench was a physical assault, and the temperature swung from the freezing point of the external environment to the scalding heat of industrial processing cycles. The pipes themselves had begun to change. Their smooth metal surfaces had developed a grotesque organic texture, pulsing with a faint, sickly light, as if the very structure of the Hive was gestating something foul. Creatures that might once have been human lurked in the shadows of maintenance junctions, their bodies twisted by constant exposure to warp-tainted effluents into shapes that were a mockery of the human form. Verix's team eliminated them with the silent efficiency of predators. A thrown knife, a suppressed bolt pistol fired at point-blank range, a snapped neck. Each kill was a whisper in the roaring darkness, risking discovery with every passing second, every delay allowing the summoning ritual to progress. They reached a nexus point where the waste systems intersected with the Hive's primary ventilation network. From here, they could begin their ascent toward the spire and the ritual chamber. But the junction was guarded. It was not a mortal soldier or even a cultist. It was a fusion of flesh, metal, and something that glowed with a cancerous green light, wearing the tattered remnants of a mechanicum robe. Its augmetic eyes scanned the junction in overlapping patterns, a web of sensors that left no approach unseen. Verix recognized the signature of the Dark Mechanicum. This was once a tech priest, now a slave to the very corruption it should have purged. Recommendations? Verix whispered into his private squad vox. Scout Pyrrhus, a warrior who had taken the name of the hero of Anchor Alpha in his honor, analyzed the geometry of the threat. We can't bypass it. Any approach triggers its sensor coverage. We need a distraction. The distraction came not from their own design, but from the chaos sown by their brothers. Deep within the Hive, Sergeant Kalen's psychological operation had borne its bitter fruit. A mob of terrified civilian workers, their fear of chaos finally eclipsing their fear of the rebellion's enforcers, stormed a guard post. The Hive's internal defense network flooded with panicked reports, a tsunami of data that demanded processing. The corrupted tech priest, its machine mind still bound by the logic of threat assessment, turned its attention inward, its augmetic eyes flickering as it processed the sudden surge of internal communications. For 3 seconds, its external sensor sweep lapsed. Verix moved. He was a blur of gray and white, crossing the open space in a heartbeat. His combat knife, forged from alloys that could pierce ceramite, found the articulated joint at the base of the creature's skull, severing the bundle of cables and organic nerve tissue that connected its corrupted brain to its weaponized body. The Guardian collapsed without a sound. a pile of twitching metal and dying flesh. Its death announcing nothing to comrades who would not register its silence for hours. "Move fast," Varix commanded, his voice a low growl. "The window won't last." His team vanished into the ventilation network, a vertical shaft that climbed toward the hive's screaming heart. The infiltration continued. Master of the Forge Caelius led the technical assault on the hive's energy shields. His force was small but potent. 6 of his own tech marines and 2 squads of tactical marines for security. These were some of the chapter's most valuable specialists, sent on a mission where failure was not an option. Direct assault was possible but would be ruinously expensive. Caelius, a being who revered the elegant solution, preferred a scalpel to a sledgehammer. "The generators are networked," he had explained during the final briefing, his voice a low thrum of metallic resonance. "Power flows between them to maintain coverage. If we can introduce a feedback loop, they will overload simultaneously." The concept was simple. The execution was nearly impossible. Caelius had identified a single, desperate vulnerability. The generators required regular maintenance, and the technicians who performed it used access routes that bypassed the primary defenses. Using identities captured during earlier reconnaissance, his team would pose as a maintenance crew. It required Caelius and his fellow tech marines to suppress their immense physical presence, to move with the hunched posture and servile deference of ordinary hive workers. The disguise, a violation of their very nature, was a necessary blasphemy. It worked. Checkpoint guards, their attention fixed on forged documentation, waved them through. They entered Generator Station 7 without raising an alarm, their maintenance kits concealing the holy tools of sabotage. Inside, the true difficulty revealed itself. The system architecture was not Imperial standard. Chaos corruption had warped the hardware and software into forms that defied conventional engineering. Caelius's fingers, half flesh and half gleaming steel, danced across corrupted control interfaces. He communed with machine spirits that screamed with the agony of their defilement, his mind a battering ram of pure logic against their tainted programming. "The network topology has redundancies we did not anticipate," he reported through a secure Vox channel. "Additional time required." First Captain Theron's voice came back, cold and absolute. "Time is what we don't have. Main assault begins in 20 minutes, with or without shield down." Caelius redoubled his efforts. His mechadendrites and servo arms deployed a dozen specialized tools, while his organic hands flew across the controls. The feedback loop began to take shape, a crude, brutal piece of code, but it would function. A technician entered the station, his face slack with surprise. He saw the armored giants where stooped workers should be, and his mouth opened to scream. Brother Varketh's bolt pistol coughed once, the subsonic round silencing the man permanently. The interruption, however, had consequences. The dead man's failure to report his check-in triggered automated queries from station management. They had bought themselves minutes, nothing more. Caelius completed his work as the first soft chimes of an internal alert began to sound. "Loop initiated," he announced. "Cascade in 7 minutes. Main assault in 13 minutes. Theron's voice updated. "Can you accelerate?" "Not without risking premature failure. The timing must be precise." 6 minutes. 6 minutes to survive in a facility that was now actively hunting them. Caelius made the only tactical decision left. "We hold this position. If they retake these controls before the cascade completes, the entire campaign fails." The defense was a nightmare of desperation. Caelius and his marines barricaded the entrances, turning a control station into a fortress. Rebel forces converged, and the corridors, too cramped for proper marine tactics, became a meat grinder. Bolter fire echoed, chewing through the station's walls and the bodies of cultists. Casualties mounted, but the clock ticked down. As the final minute bled away, a wave of energy, visible even through the station's walls, pulsed outward. The polar night lit up, as if a new sun had been born. All across Hive Septimus, the shield generators overloaded in a chain reaction of catastrophic failure. When the light faded, only 4 of Callius's original team were still standing amidst the wreckage and the dead. "Mission accomplished," Callius reported, his voice thick with the exhaustion of combat barely survived. "The Hive is open." Sergeant Kalin's psychological operation bore fruit not with a gentle blossoming, but with a violent, explosive rupture. The seeds he had planted over the preceding days, whispered promises of imperial amnesty, the Aquila scratched onto grimy walls, rumors of rebel atrocities, germinated in the fertile soil of desperation. It began in the labor districts, where the revolution's promises had soured into a reality of longer hours, smaller rations, and the gnawing fear of being reported for insufficient devotion. The first spark ignited in Manufactorum District 7. Guards attempted to enforce a mandatory loyalty assembly, but the workers, exhausted, hungry, and now armed with the dangerous knowledge that the Imperium was winning elsewhere, refused to comply. A guard struck a worker. The crowd surged. Improvised weapons, tools of labor repurposed for killing, appeared in 100 hands. The violence spread like a contagion of defiance. District 7's uprising became the signal fire for District 8. The Hab blocks of Section 12 saw the flames and rose in turn. Within hours, the Hive's lower levels had become a morass of internal conflict, their populations more interested in surviving the coming assault than defending a cause they no longer believed in. From his infiltration post, Kalin monitored the spreading chaos, transmitting constant updates to the chapter master. "The diversionary effect exceeds all projections," his voice reported, calm despite the carnage unfolding on his sensor displays. "Rebel forces are being pulled from primary defensive positions to suppress internal unrest. Assault windows are opening across multiple sectors. But the success was a poisoned chalice. The rebels responded to the uprising with indiscriminate, brutal force. Fire teams moved through residential areas, their weapons spitting death at anyone found outside designated shelters. The civilian uprising became a civilian massacre. The death toll climbed into the hundreds, then the thousands, as Kalin watched from above, a helpless god witnessing a tragedy of his own making. "We need to accelerate the main assault," he urged through the vox, his composure finally cracking. "Every minute we delay costs civilian lives." Vortigern's response was a monolith of cold command logic. The assault proceeds according to plan. Premature action risks operational failure and greater casualties overall. Kalin terminated the link. He accepted the decision, but he could not accept its consequences. He opened a private channel to Sister Medici Iolanthe, positioned with the evacuation teams at the Hive's edge. "I'm identifying safe corridors for civilian evacuation. Can your teams extract people from these coordinates?" "That is not part of the operational plan." "Sergeant," Iolanthe's voice came back, tight with protocol. "Plans change," Kalin countered, his voice raw. "People are dying who don't have to die. Help me save them." The unauthorized evacuation began. Iolanthe's medical teams, supplemented by the local militia forces from other hives, began pulling civilians from the designated danger zones. They moved through maintenance tunnels and forgotten serviceways that Kalen identified, routes that his enhanced senses saw as clear, even as the main thoroughfares ran with blood. When first Captain Theron reported the deviation, Chapter Master Vortigern's reaction was surprisingly measured. "Sergeant Kalen has exceeded his orders again." "Should disciplinary action be initiated?" Theron asked. After the campaign, Vortigern replied, "For now, his initiative provides unexpected benefits. The evacuation routes he is identifying reveal defensive gaps we can exploit. Sometimes, insubordination serves the chapter better than obedience." The civilian uprising reached its zenith. The rebel command structure, fractured and overwhelmed, struggled to coordinate a response to threats from within and without. The main assault, launching minutes ahead of Vortigern's accelerated schedule, found the defenders of Hive Septimus in complete disarray. But deep in the Hive's corrupted heart, the summoning ritual continued, its sorcerers drawing strength from the very chaos that was tearing their fortress apart. With the Hive's shields shattered and its defenders consumed by internal chaos, Chapter Master Vortigern committed his main assault force. It was the largest single deployment of the Carthax Prime campaign. 240 battle brothers descended on Hive Septimus, their Thunderhawk gunships screaming through polar winds that would have torn lesser craft from the sky. The assault came from all directions at once. Vortigern himself led from the front, his command squad dropping directly into the Hive's upper reaches, where the rebel leadership's bunkers clustered around the summoning site. His presence was a declaration. The chapter master was betting his own life on the outcome. The descent was a maelstrom of fire and fury. Anti-aircraft batteries, still functional despite the shield's collapse, painted the sky with explosive light. A Thunderhawk took a direct hit, its shell rupturing as it spiraled into the Hive's outer structures, its crew and the squad of Marines aboard killed instantly. Another limped away, trailing black smoke, its surviving warriors forced to deploy in an unplanned landing zone, fighting their way toward objectives they could no longer easily reach. Vortigern's gunship slammed down hard on a landing platform overlooking the Hive's central spire. The structure was a blasphemy of architecture, a tower of black metal and corrupted stone that clawed at the frozen sky. Its surface crawled with geometric patterns that hurt the eye, and its peak pulsed with a sickly energy that flooded scanner frequencies. Vortigern pointed his power sword at its apex. "That is our objective," he announced over the command vox. "Whatever they are summoning, they are doing it there. Kill everything between us and that location." The Iron Requiem advanced. The rebels defending these upper levels were not the demoralized conscripts from the lower Hive. They were true believers, chaos cultists whose eyes burned with zealous fire, and who fought with no regard for their own survival. The battle quickly degenerated into a series of brutal, close-quarters engagements in corridors too narrow for effective ranged fire. Chainswords roared to life, biting through corrupted flesh and armor. In return, cultist blades, blessed by dark powers, found the gaps in ceramite plate. The casualty rate climbed steadily, but the Space Marines advanced, a tide of iron and faith, absorbing losses that would have shattered any mortal formation. Far below, First Captain Theron led the secondary assault, his force fighting upward through hab levels where every engagement was a moral minefield. The rebels used terrified citizens as human shields, forcing Theron's warriors to choose between tactical efficiency and the lives of innocents. "Minimize collateral damage," Theron ordered, his voice grim. The decision slowed their advance and cost them 2 Marines, caught in an ambush that could have been broken if they had been willing to fire through the cowering civilians. Master of the Forge Caelius, his technical mission complete, joined the assault with his few surviving tech marines. His intimate knowledge of corrupted systems proved invaluable as the rebels activated dormant defense networks. Helios and his specialists countered each activation, their machine communion buying precious seconds for the advancing assault squads. The separate elements of the attack converged on the Spire's base, their momentum unstoppable, but their casualties mounting. As they prepared for the final ascent, a secured Vox channel crackled to life. It was Scout Sergeant Varix, still operating deep inside the Spire. "The ritual is accelerating," he reported. "They know they are losing. They are trying to complete the summoning before you can stop them." Vortigern absorbed the intelligence and made his final decision. "All units, maximum assault. Abandon standard protocols. Speed over safety. We reach that chamber before the summoning completes, or we all die trying." The final push began. The Iron Requiem hurled themselves at the Spire's defenses with reckless abandon, their discipline giving way to a controlled fury. The cost would be terrible. The alternative was infinitely worse. Chapter: Master Vortigern breached the ritual chamber's doors with a melt-a-charge that turned adamantium to slag. The superheated air that washed over him was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and foul. What lay beyond tested the limits of his 4 centuries of composure. The chamber was a blasphemy of physics. It occupied the Spire's upper third, yet the space within was vast, a cavernous dome that could have contained a starship. The walls were not walls, but shimmering, unstable windows into somewhere else, showing impossible colors and geometries that clawed at the sanity. At the chamber's center, a circle of 13 sorcerers chanted, in a language that tore at reality like razored claws, their voices a chorus of damnation. And from the heart of their circle, something was rising. It possessed no fixed form. Its shape boiled and shifted, a chaotic mass of energy and nascent matter that suggested eyes, mouths, and limbs in combinations that changed faster than the mind could process. It existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, its arrival incomplete, but accelerating with every foul syllable the sorcerers spoke. "Break the circle," Vortigern commanded over the Vox, his battle brothers charging forward, even as the chamber's wrongness pressed in on their senses, threatening to overwhelm their psycho-indoctrinated minds. The sorcerers defended their work with powers that mocked conventional warfare. Bolt rounds fired by the advancing Marines curved away from their targets, deflected by invisible hands. One Marine, Brother Hector, got too close, and his ceramite armor began to crush inward, its molecular bonds failing without apparent cause. He collapsed, a mangled ruin of metal and flesh. Another brother simply stopped. He froze mid-stride, his form flickering like a faulty pict cast before his existence was unwritten from reality by a casual gesture from a sorcerer whose eyes burned with stolen fire. Vortigern reached the nearest sorcerer through sheer indomitable will, his power sword ignoring the reality-bending defenses through the sheer force of Imperial faith. The blade bisected its target, and for a moment the ritual stuttered, one voice silenced from the choir. But the partially manifested thing responded. A limb that was neither tentacle nor claw lashed out, catching 2 Marines and pulling them into its roiling mass. Their screams were cut short as they ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The battle became a maelstrom of desperation. Marines died with each passing second, but so did sorcerers. For every brother lost, another warrior would close the distance and deliver the Emperor's judgment. The mathematics were brutal. Could Vortigern eliminate 13 sorcerers before his entire force was annihilated? A section of the ceiling's ventilation grating blew outward, and Scout Sergeant Verix and his team dropped into the chamber, striking from an unexpected angle. His first shot, fired from a modified stalker pattern bolter, took a sorcerer in the back of the skull, dropping the count to 10. His second target deflected the bolt with a shimmering shield of force, but the distraction allowed another Marine to close the distance and finish the work with a chainsword. 8 sorcerers remained. Chief Librarian Malvox entered the chamber, his force sword humming with psychic energy. He immediately engaged in a war of the mind, his consciousness grappling with the sorcerer's combined power. The strain was immense. Blood streamed from his eyes and nose, but he held, creating fractures in their psychic defenses that his brothers exploited with brutal efficiency. 5 sorcerers. The entity at the center screamed, a psychic shriek that burst eardrums and cracked armor plating. Marines collapsed under the assault, their enhanced physiology no proof against such concentrated warp energy. 3 sorcerers. The ritual's geometry began to collapse, the impossible windows flickering and showing increasingly chaotic vistas as reality fought to reassert itself. 1 sorcerer, the leader, his body glowing with accumulated power, made a final, desperate bid. He channeled everything he had left into the summoning, trying to complete the manifestation through sheer force of will. Vortigern reached him as the attempt faltered. His power sword, carrying the weight of the God Emperor's blessing, pierced the sorcerer's corrupted heart. The ritual shattered. The entity, denied its anchor and full manifestation, was torn apart by forces beyond mortal comprehension, pulled back into the warp with a final, silent howl that would haunt the survivor's dreams for centuries. The chamber returned to its normal dimensions. Of the 37 Marines who had charged through the door, only 19 remained standing. The summoning was prevented. But the battle for Hive Septimus was far from over. The entity's banishment did not end the corruption of Hive Septimus. 3 years of concentrated warp influence had left a spiritual stain that would take generations to fully cleanse. The immediate threat of a mass demonic incursion had been averted, but the remaining work fell to specialists the Iron Requiem had reluctantly learned to rely upon. Inquisitor Vashti Morn assumed control of purification operations, her authority in matters of heresy absolute under Imperial law. Her methods were brutal, systematic, and chillingly efficient. Her black-clad stormtroopers and death cult assassins moved through the hive, establishing screening checkpoints and quarantine zones. Every citizen was to be examined for warp taint, every structure inspected for physical corruption, and anything that failed the tests was to be destroyed. The screening process revealed the infection's true, horrifying extent. Roughly 15% of the hive's surviving population carried corruption significant enough to warrant immediate execution. Millions of souls deemed irredeemable. Another 30% showed minor taint, designated for decades of hard labor in penitential work crews. The remainder tested clean, their exposure insufficient to produce permanent effects. Chapter Master Vortigern observed the mass executions with grim acceptance. He had saved billions by preventing the summoning. The millions who now had to die were an acceptable cost by the cold calculus of imperial mathematics. Yet the scale of the slaughter challenged even his hardened conscience. From a high vantage point, he watched as firing squads processed another batch of condemned citizens, their autogun fire a constant rolling thunder that echoed through the hive's canyons. "Is this necessary?" he asked Morn, who stood beside him, her face impassive. These people were victims. The entity corrupted them against their will. Their will became irrelevant the moment corruption took root, Morn responded, not bothering to look at the scenes below. Perhaps some could be saved through years of intensive effort. Effort the Imperium cannot afford to spend. Every corrupt soul we leave alive becomes a seed for future heresy. I am not cruel, Chapter Master. I am thorough. The purification extended to the hive's very bones. Entire Hab districts were sealed off, their populations still inside, and subjected to cleansing by sacred fire. Promethium flamers wielded by Morn's purges, squads turned city blocks into infernos, burning away the warp taint, but also destroying everything and everyone within. The hive's productive capacity was crippled for decades to come. Amid this organized slaughter, the Iron Requiem's own casualties continued to mount. Cultists who had escaped the ritual chamber's destruction rallied fanatical followers for suicidal last stands in the hive's depths. Corrupted machinery, dormant for days, whirred to life without warning, its automated arms crushing Marines in what were logged as industrial accidents. Worse, some of the brothers who had fought in the ritual chamber began showing signs of taint themselves. Their exposure had exceeded safe limits. Chaplain Morthane handled these cases personally, his face a mask of iron resolve. He administered the Emperor's peace to 5 battle brothers whose genetic legacy was too valuable to lose to damnation. Each time, the crack of his bolt pistol was a wound to the chapter that would take centuries to heal. But amid the horror, signs of recovery began to emerge. Citizens who had been spared by the screening process came out of hiding to assist with restoration efforts. Militia forces, drawn from the pacified hives, helped Morn's troops maintain order, while the remaining Marines focused on hunting down the last pockets of armed resistance. Brother Sergeant Kalen coordinated these civilian liaison efforts, applying the lessons learned in other hives to accelerate the reconciliation. His approach, treating the citizens as potential allies rather than merely conquered subjects, produced results that traditional Imperial methods would not. "They want to believe in the Emperor again," Kalen reported to Vortigern in the command post. The rebellion promised them freedom, but delivered only corruption. We represent something they had forgotten was possible: salvation. Vortigern considered Kalen's words as he surveyed Hive Septimus's changed skyline, towers toppled, districts still smoldering, but its core structure intact. Salvation requires more than survival. It requires meaning. Can we give them that? "We can try," Kalen said. "That's more than the old Imperium offered." The beat of autoguns finally fell silent. The last of the rebel leaders were hunted down and executed. Imperial authority was formally restored, and the long, painful process of healing began. 7 hives had fallen. The conquest of Carthax Prime was entering its final phase. The conquest of Carthax Prime's remaining population centers proceeded with an efficiency that was almost anticlimactic. The war was won not in the final battles, but in the psychological collapse that followed the fall of Hive Septimus. When the Iron Requiem fleet appeared in orbit above Hive Octavius, its citizens did not man the guns. They rioted against their own leadership, demanding a surrender that was already inevitable. The Hive's massive gates, fortified for a siege that would never come, groaned open to reveal not defiant warriors, but a procession of civic leaders carrying banners of truce. Chapter Master Vortigern accepted their capitulation in person. He did not demand groveling or retribution, only compliance. This pattern repeated across the equatorial belt. Hive Nonus and the scattered arcology settlements capitulated within days, their rebellions dissolving into memory. Each peaceful surrender preserved lives, both Space Marine and civilian, resources the Imperium could ill afford to waste. When the final accounting was complete, the statistics told a story that bordered on myth. The Iron Requiem, a chapter of 847 Battle Brothers, had conquered a world of 19 billion souls. Their total casualties numbered 112 killed and 219 wounded, most of whom would eventually return to service. Civilian casualties, while still horrific, numbered approximately 90 million, a mere fraction of the billions who would have died in a conventional imperial reconquest or the absolute finality of exterminatus. These numbers, when they reached the distant offices of the Administratum and the Lord Commander's militant, prompted deeply uncomfortable questions. If the Iron Requiem's methods could achieve such results, why were they not standard doctrine? Why did the Imperium routinely sacrifice millions of Imperial Guard troops and burn entire continents to conquer worlds that Space Marines could take with a fraction of the cost? The answers were political. They were etched into the 10,000-year-old scar tissue of the Horus heresy. The Imperium deliberately constrains its Space Marine chapters, limiting their numbers, circumscribing their autonomy, monitoring their methods, because it fears what they might become if unchained. A chapter that could conquer and govern worlds independently was a nascent empire, a potential threat worse than any Xenos or heretic. Vortigern understood these constraints better than most. Inquisitor Morn made sure of it. In a private meeting held in a quiet chamber high in Hive Primus, she laid the reality bare. "You have created something dangerous," she told him, her voice a low, measured tone that carried more weight than a shout. "Not heretical. Nothing you have done violates Imperial law, but dangerous nonetheless. Your methods suggest that Space Marines can be more than weapons. That threatens factions who benefit from them being nothing else. I have served the Emperor faithfully for 400 years, Vortigern responded, his voice a low rumble. My loyalty is not in question. Your loyalty to the Emperor is certain. Your loyalty to the Imperium's institutions may be inconvenient. Morn's eyes held warnings she could not speak aloud. Be careful what you document. Be careful what you share. Some lessons are safer left unlearned. The conversation haunted Vortigern as he oversaw the final stages of the conquest. He had demonstrated that Space Marines could conquer worlds without destroying them, but that very demonstration might prove more dangerous to his chapter than any rebellion. Meanwhile, the Iron Requiem's Battle Brothers adapted to the strange new reality of garrison duty. They were warriors, not peacekeepers. Some chafed at the lack of combat, their gene seed demanding action their new circumstances denied. They patrolled silent streets, their bolters held at a low ready, their eyes scanning for threats that never materialized. But others embraced the unusual assignment. They found purpose in rebuilding what they had fought to preserve. Brother Sergeant Kalen emerged as an unofficial liaison to the civilian population. His squad, now informally called the Rebuilders by the citizens they helped, spent more time coordinating reconstruction projects than conducting patrols. Observing his men distributing food supplies and helping engineers repair a damaged water conduit, Kalen felt a profound shift. We are changing, he said to one of his men. Whether that change serves the Emperor or damages his cause, only time will reveal. 3 months after the last embers of rebellion were extinguished on Carthax Prime, a new kind of power arrived. It descended not in a Thunderhawk gunship, but in a gilded shuttle whose hull gleamed with the seals of the Lord Commander Militant of the Segmentum Solar. It carried no warriors, only a single man whose authority could command armies and silence heroes. Strategos Admiral Horatius Vane had served the Imperium's military bureaucracy for over a century, his life extended by juvenile treatments that left his skin smooth but his eyes ancient. His battles were fought in silent conference rooms and through precisely crafted reports, yet his decisions shaped the fate of billions. Chapter Master Vortigern met him in the newly restored Governor's Palace in Hive Primus. The air still smelled of ozone and fresh promethium-laced paint. A thin veneer of imperial order spread over the scars of war. Vane, draped in the robes of his station, settled into an ornate chair that had once belonged to the world's traitor governor. His presence seemed to absorb the room's grandeur, leaving Vortigern, a giant in polished ceramite, feeling like a subordinate in his own victory. "You have answered a question that many believed had no answer," Vane began, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment. He gestured to a data slate his servitor held. "How many space marines does it take to conquer a planet? Your data suggests fewer than conventional wisdom assumed." "Space marines are not designed for conquest," Vortigern replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor plates. "We are designed for surgical strikes against targets too dangerous for conventional forces. Carthax Prime required an adaptation of that purpose." "And yet you adapted, successfully," Vane said, his eyes flicking over the data slate. "The question becomes, was Carthax Prime an exception, or does your success suggest broader implications?" The discussion that followed was a clinical dissection of a war. Vane's questions were scalpels, seeking casualty ratios, resource consumption, timeline comparisons with conventional reconquest operations. He inquired about the long-term occupation requirements, the psychic fallout, the material cost of every tactical choice. Vortigern provided honest, precise answers, but he remained guarded. He described the cooperation with Inquisitor Morn without emphasizing its necessity. He acknowledged the use of local militia forces without detailing their critical role. He discussed tactical innovations without connecting them to a new, overarching doctrine. After nearly an hour, Vane set his slate aside. "You are being careful, Chapter Master," he observed. "You recognize that your success creates as many problems as it solves." "I recognize that the Imperium's institutions are not designed to process innovation," Vortigern stated, the words tasting like ash. "What works on one world may fail on another. What seems efficient in isolation may prove catastrophic when scaled." "A diplomatic answer," Vane said, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his ancient eyes. "The truth is simpler. If Space Marine chapters routinely conquer worlds independently, the balance of power shifts away from the institutions that rely on their dependency. The High Lords of Terra would not welcome such a shift." There it was, the true purpose of this visit. It was not an evaluation, it was an audit, a containment protocol. "My recommendation will be carefully calibrated," Vane concluded, rising from his chair. "Your methods will be documented as conditional successes, suitable for limited application under specific circumstances. The documentation will be classified at levels that prevent widespread distribution. The Iron Requiem will receive commendations for loyalty and effectiveness, and the Imperium will continue as it always has." A cold fury, an emotion Vortigern had not felt in a century, rose within him. "Billions die unnecessarily because of that continuation," he said, his voice dangerously low. Vane paused at the doorway. He turned, his face a mask of weary pragmatism. "Billions die regardless, Chapter Master. The question is which billions, and whether their deaths serve institutional stability. That is the calculus that governs the Imperium. I did not create it. I merely operate within it. Vortigern stood alone in the cavernous hall long after the shuttle's engines had faded into silence. He had answered the question the administratum had asked, and the answer, he now understood, would change nothing at all. Apothecary Helix moved with the practiced economy of 2 centuries through the sterile white halls of the inevitable verdicts apothecarian. Before him, laid out in precise rows upon a steel tray, were 112 progenoid glands. Each one, a small, unassuming organ of bioengineered flesh, contained the genetic soul of a fallen battle brother. Each was a promise of continuation and a testament to loss. The chapter's effective strength had been reduced by nearly 15%. Rebuilding would take decades. Helix reviewed the casualty logs, his clinical training warring with the memories the names evoked. Brother Pyrrhus, the scout, whose gene seed now rested in stasis container Alpha 7. He had died destroying Anchor Alpha, his potential of fire extinguished before it could truly blaze. Sergeant Talos, container Beta 3, lost in the inferno of the reactor assault after 90 years of service, his experience a library burned to the ground. And Brother Corvain, Gamma 9, the heavy weapons specialist who had died with a combat knife in his hand, his heavy bolter never fired, his dry wit silenced forever. These deaths, and 100 others, were the true cost of Carthax Prime. Statistics measured victory. The empty spaces in the ranks measured the price. First Captain Theron entered the Apothecarian, his armor devoid of ceremonial polish, its surface a map of the recent campaign's violence. He stood before the tray of recovered gene seed, his gaze lingering on each container. He had commanded these men, trained them, and led them to their deaths. Was it worth it? Helix asked, the question escaping his lips before discipline could restrain it. It was a forbidden question, but in the silent presence of the dead, it felt necessary. Theron considered the query for a long moment. The mathematical analysis says yes, he answered, his voice flat. Fewer Marines died than would have perished in a conventional campaign. Fewer civilians died than would have perished under exterminatus. By every measure the Imperium uses, we achieved unprecedented success. But, Helix pressed, sensing the unspoken qualification. But mathematics cannot measure what we lost, Theron continued, his enhanced features for once showing the strain of his office. Brothers who represented centuries of accumulated experience, genetic lines that stretched back to the chapter's founding. The institutional knowledge that dies with each fallen warrior. He looked away from the gene seed, his eyes meeting Helix's. We saved a world. We may have damaged a chapter. Chaplain Morthane and Chief Librarian Malvox arrived together, drawn by the same grim duty. Every death served the Emperor's purpose, Morthane intoned, his voice a balm intended to soothe a wound too deep for words. The fallen now stand among his eternal defenders. Death is transformation, not an ending, Malvox added, his own perspective philosophical. The chapter persists, even as individuals pass. Their words were correct, orthodox, and hollow. They bounced off the cold steel of the Apothecarian and the colder reality of the 112 empty places at the feasting tables. Then, Chapter Master Vortigern arrived. His presence silenced all discussion. He surveyed the recovered gene seed, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers, acknowledging their shared grief without needing to speak of it. We will remember them, he announced, his voice the final word, the traditional benediction that closed the book on the dead. Their sacrifice purchased victory. Their legacy ensures continuation. The Iron Requiem endures because they did not. The ceremony was complete. The fallen were honored. The living had to continue their work. Later, alone in the darkness of his private quarters, Vortigern allowed himself the grief he could not show his chapter. He had led Marines to their deaths countless times across 4 centuries. But these casualties felt different. He had chosen this campaign, these methods, this path. Every death was a direct consequence of his decisions. "The Emperor demands sacrifice," he whispered to the empty room, the words a prayer and an accusation. "But he does not demand that sacrifice be meaningless. I gave their deaths meaning." He repeated the words, forcing himself to believe them. "I must." The weight of command pressed down. As heavy as ceramite, as inescapable as duty itself. 6 months after the formal pacification, Carthax Prime settled into the uncomfortable rhythms of imperial restoration. The rebellion was over, its banners burned, and its leaders executed, but its aftermath persisted in the quiet desperation of the hive cities. The air, once thick with the smoke of battle, now carried the dust of grinding poverty. Brother Sergeant Kalen, now commanding a semi-permanent garrison force in Hive Primus, found himself navigating challenges his training had never anticipated. He stood in a manufactorum's forecourt, the air acrid with ozone and sweat, listening to a man whose face was a mask of exhausted despair. The foreman's pleas were not for protection from Xenos or heretics, but from the demands of an imperial tithe schedule that made no allowance for a world recently torn apart by war. "They will not make the quota, Sergeant," the foreman explained, his voice cracking. "My people work 18-hour shifts. They collapse at their stations. We are recycling nutrient paste that was condemned 2 years ago. The Administratum's demands, they will kill us faster than the rebels ever could." Kalen's training offered no solution. These problems could not be solved with bolter fire or a chainsword. Later, during a squad briefing in their commandeered barracks, the frustration boiled over. "This is not what we were made for," Brother Varketh complained, his gauntlet clenched into a fist. "We are warriors, not administrators. Let the Administratum send its own functionaries to starve these people." "There is no one else," Kalen responded, his voice flat and weary. "The Administratum is content to let Carthax Prime rot, so long as the tithes continue. We remain because Chapter Master Vortigern refuses to abandon what we conquered." The contradiction sat at the heart of their new duty. The Iron Requiem had conquered Carthax Prime using methods that preserved its infrastructure and its people. Now, the Imperium's own systems were systematically destroying what the Marines had fought to save, grinding the citizens into a state of desperation that would inevitably ferment into new rebellion. Kalen began compiling reports, documenting the systemic failures, the gap between imperial policy and effective governance. Aboard the inevitable verdict, Vortigern reviewed the data slates with a cold, growing anger. "The Administratum is sabotaging our victory," he concluded, showing the latest assessment to First Captain Theron. "Not deliberately. They lack the coherence for such a conspiracy, but effectively nonetheless. Their systems assume a conquered world must be punished." "Can we intervene?" Theron asked. "Not without exceeding our authority," Vortigern said, the words tasting like ash. "Chapter Master does not equate to Planetary Governor. If I attempt to redirect tithes or modify quotas, I invite sanctions that could cripple the chapter for a generation." The limits of their power had never been so stark. They could shatter armies and topple worlds, but they were helpless against the colossal inertia of imperial bureaucracy. Kalen, on the ground, could no longer tolerate the gap between authority and responsibility. He witnessed a squad of tithe enforcers seizing a Medici convoy, its supplies destined for a hab block where a fever was spreading. He saw the faces of the citizens, their brief flicker of hope turning back to despair. And he made his choice. His squad moved without a word, forming a silent ceramite wall between the enforcers and the convoy. The enforcers, faced with 8-foot giants in power armor, made the wise decision to retreat. Sister Medici Iolanthe found him later, her face etched with concern. "You're breaking a dozen regulations, Kalen. That was an officially sanctioned confiscation." Kalen looked out over the sprawling hive, a city his brothers had died to save, a city that was now dying by inches. "Regulations are breaking people," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Which violation serves the Emperor? Obedience that destroys, or disobedience that preserves?" The question hung in the polluted air, an act of heresy and of faith. He did not know what consequences would come, but he had chosen his path. The entity's influence, though banished, had left a stain upon the soul of Carthax Prime. It was an echo in the immaterium, a psychic residue that manifested in the darkest hours of the hive cities. Librarian Codicea Thien, assigned to monitor the planet's spiritual condition, felt it first as a subtle dissonance, a wrong note in the chorus of 19 billion minds. Then came the reports. Citizens across the planet woke screaming from nightmares they could not remember, but could not forget, their minds filled with images of a vast, patient hunger in an endless dark. The suicide rate, which had stabilized during the occupation, began to climb once more. Theon extended his senses, probing the warp for the source. What he found confirmed his deepest fears. The entity had not been destroyed. It was dormant, wounded, its consciousness shattered, but not extinguished. It had retreated to anchor points the Inquisition's purges had somehow missed. Not grand structures, but something far more insidious. Fragments of its being had embedded themselves in the very fabric of the population's restored misery. He stood before Chapter Master Vortigern in the Strategium, the hololithic display of Carthax Prime, a silent witness. "We didn't destroy it," Theon reported, his voice devoid of its usual calm. "We drove it back, but its roots run deeper than we realized. It's rebuilding, slowly, carefully, but it is rebuilding." The news landed with the weight of a failed campaign. What had been a decisive, paradigm-shifting victory was now revealed to be a temporary respite. The world they had sacrificed so much to save remained vulnerable. Vortigern considered the options, each one a testament to the Imperium's brutal calculus. They could commit to an indefinite occupation, bleeding the chapter's resources until it was unable to answer other calls to war. They could request exterminatus, burning the world to ash and turning their victory into a monument of failure. Or they could ask the Inquisition for further aid, inviting political entanglements that could destabilize the chapter for decades. "There is another possibility," Theon suggested, his voice dropping. "The entity feeds on suffering. Despair is its sustenance. If we can reduce that suffering, genuinely improve the conditions of the populace, we starve it. It cannot rebuild without power, and it cannot gather power from a population that has hope." The proposal was a violation of imperial orthodoxy, which taught that suffering was a crucible for faith. Vortigern stared at the librarian, processing the tactical logic that masqueraded as compassion. "You're suggesting we improve their living conditions not as a moral imperative, but as a tactical necessity." "I'm suggesting they are one and the same," Theon countered, his conviction hardening his voice. "The Emperor created us to protect humanity. If we protect them from the Xenos and the heretic, only to watch them be destroyed by the Imperium's own broken systems. What have we accomplished? If Carthax Prime is to remain free of chaos, its people must have a reason to resist corruption. We must give them that reason. The conversation echoed every unorthodox decision made during the campaign, but now it was no longer a philosophical debate. It was a practical imperative. Vortigern made his choice. The Iron Requiem would remain on Carthax Prime, but their mission would change. They would become architects of recovery, not just enforcers of order. Document everything, Vortigern instructed Theon, the command sealing their fate. If this works, we provide a new model for the Imperium to follow. If it fails, we provide a lesson in what not to attempt. The project began in the shadows. Kaelin's unauthorized interventions became semi-official policy. Resources were diverted through unofficial channels, bypassing the Administratum's ledgers. Food, medicine, and technical aid flowed to the communities that needed them most. Slowly, the psychic atmosphere of the planet began to lighten. The entity's recovery stalled, its tendrils of influence finding less and less despair to cling to. But their success did not go unnoticed. Within months, shuttles began to arrive. Representatives from other Imperial factions, their curiosity piqued by reports of unusual stability and productivity, came to see what the Iron Requiem was building. Visibility brought a new kind of risk, a danger that no amount of bolter fire could counter. The shuttle descended without warning, its hull a canvas of gold and ivory that stood in stark contrast to the utilitarian gray of the landing pad. It bore the twin-headed aquila of the Imperium, but intertwined with the icons of the Ministorum, the sigil of the Ecclesiarchy. The delegation that disembarked moved with the unhurried confidence of those who believe their authority comes from the God Emperor himself. At their head was a man in robes of crimson and white, his face a mask of pious severity. Cardinal Bishop Tertius Maxim, a politician wearing the vestments of a priest, had come to investigate. The meeting took place in a chamber that still smelled of ozone and cordite. Maxim's gaze swept over the battle-scarred walls, his expression one of distaste. "The Emperor demands faith, Chapter Master, not comfort," he began, his voice echoing with the practiced cadence of 1,000 sermons. "We have received reports of your occupation. Your methods appear to elevate material conditions above spiritual development. This concerns the Ecclesiarchy greatly." Vortigern stood motionless, his immense frame a monolith of ceramite and resolve. "Our methods serve spiritual development by removing the obstacles to it," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "A citizen who starves cannot contemplate the Emperor. A citizen who lives in constant fear cannot pray with conviction. We provide the stability that enables faith." "An interesting interpretation," Maxim said, a flicker of coldness in his eyes. "Some might call it heresy. The Inquisition has examined our operations and found them within acceptable parameters," Vortigern stated, the words a carefully deployed weapon. "Do you question the judgment of the Holy Ordos?" The air crackled with the unspoken threat. Maxim's expression did not change, but he shifted his approach. "Of course not. We merely wish to aid your righteous work. A partnership? My missionaries will embed within your forces, spreading the imperial creed, and ensuring the flock does not stray while you attend to matters of security." Vortigern recognized the offer for what it was, a cage gilded with Holy Scripture. The missionaries would be spies, reporting every deviation from orthodox practice. To accept was to accept surveillance. To refuse was to declare war on the Ministorum. "We accept," he said, his voice betraying nothing. "The missionaries will operate under chapter authority while on Carthax Prime. Their safety is our responsibility. Their activities must not interfere with pacification operations." Maxim smiled, a thin, dry expression that did not reach his eyes. He had gotten what he came for. The Cardinal Bishop was only the first. A rogue trader arrived, his eyes gleaming with avarice as he assessed the planet's recovering industries. Amagos from the Adeptus Mechanicus made inquiries about the pre-imperial technology the chapter had uncovered, his servo-skulls whirring with acquisitive hunger. An ambassador from a neighboring governor proposed alliances Vortigern had no authority to make. The Iron Requiem had become entangled in a web of politics that their bolters could not sever. Brother Sergeant Kalen watched the endless procession of visitors with a growing unease. He sought out the chapter master in a rare moment of quiet. "We came here to conquer a world," Kalen said, his voice low. "Now we govern one. We negotiate with factions and build alliances that extend far beyond our charter. At what point do we become something other than Space Marines?" "When we stop serving the Emperor's purpose," Vortigern replied, his gaze fixed on the cityscape beyond the window. "We adapted to conquer Carthax Prime. Now we adapt to hold it. Adaptation is not corruption, Kalen. It is evolution. Evolution toward what?" The question hung in the air, a ghost that haunted the chapter's victory. Vortigern finally turned, his scarred face a mask of certainty he did not entirely feel. "Toward whatever the Emperor requires of us. We cannot know his plan. We can only trust that serving humanity serves him." Later, alone in his strategium, Vortigern reviewed encrypted reports from across the galaxy. On a dozen worlds, other chapters faced similar impossible choices, their missions pushing them beyond the limits of the Codex Astartes. The Iron Requiem was not unique. They were simply the most visible symptom of a change spreading throughout the Emperor's angels, a quiet evolution born of necessity. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that the Imperium's ancient powers would not allow it to continue unchallenged. The recruiting halls of the inevitable verdict were filled with a generation forged in fire and terror. The aspirants of Carthax Prime were unlike any the Iron Requiem had ever inducted. They were gaunt, their eyes holding a feral caution that no amount of Imperial indoctrination had yet managed to erase. These were not the noble sons of hive nobility or the pious youths of shrine worlds. They were survivors of rebellion, occupation, and the subtle poison of chaos. Apothecary Helix presented a data slate to Chapter Master Vortigern. The hololithic display showed the profile of a single boy, 16 years of age, aspirant Vex. "He was born during the 3rd year of the uprising," Helix reported, his voice a clinical monotone. "His earliest memories are of artillery bombardments and the taste of starvation rations. He witnessed his family's execution by rebel enforcers. He survived through cunning, scavenging, and a capacity for violence that disturbs even our training sergeants." Vortigern studied the psychological assessment, unusually adapted to extreme circumstances. It was a sterile, bureaucratic phrase for a soul that had been scoured of its humanity. His physical trials exceed all projections, but his psychological foundations are unstable. The implantation process will either reinforce his strengths or magnify his dysfunctions. We cannot predict which. Are you recommending rejection, Apothecary? "I am recommending awareness, Chapter Master," Helix replied. "These aspirants will become Marines unlike any we have produced. Their experiences make them exceptionally suited to the kind of asymmetric warfare we pioneered on their world. They may also prove dangerously unsuited to conventional discipline. Vortigern stared at the image of the boy, at the cold, calculating intelligence in his eyes. The chapter needed to replenish its ranks. The losses from Carthax Prime still echoed in the empty cells of the fortress monastery. "Proceed with the recruitment," he commanded. "We will accept the risk." The process was brutal. The gene seed took root in bodies already hardened by deprivation. The psycho-indoctrination battled with memories too traumatic to be easily overwritten. Many aspirants failed, their bodies rejecting the implants, or their minds shattering under the strain. But those who survived emerged as something new. Vex endured. His body accepted each new organ with an almost greedy ease, his frame swelling with transhuman muscle. But the change was more than physical. His pragmatism was not erased, but honed to a razor's edge. He showed no reverence for the traditions of the Codex Astartes, questioning orders that seemed inefficient, and viewing his fellow aspirants not as brothers in faith, but as assets in a tactical alliance. His training sergeant's report was both a condemnation and a commendation. "He fights like a Marine, but thinks like a feral worlder," the veteran wrote. "He has no framework for duty or honor, only for survival and victory." Brother Sergeant Kalen saw not a flaw, but a reflection. In these angry, damaged youths, he recognized the same willingness to look beyond doctrine that had defined his own service. He volunteered to mentor Vex's training cohort, seeing a chance to shape the chapter's future. In a private session, away from the watchful eyes of the chaplains, he spoke to them directly. "The Imperium is changing," Kalen told the silent youths. "The old certainties are crumbling. You represent what comes next. Marines who can adapt to circumstances the Codex never anticipated. Learn the traditions, then learn when to ignore them." The beat concluded as Vex and his cohort completed their initial training. They were no longer boys, but not yet fully men. They were scouts, their armor the flat black of initiates, their faces still holding the shadows of the world that made them. As Vortigern watched them deploy for their first reconnaissance mission, he reflected on what the Iron Requiem was becoming. The old was giving way to the new. The chapter was evolving, and evolution, by its very nature, was a violent and unpredictable process. The missionaries from the ecclesiarchy arrived like a slow-acting poison. They wore the humble robes of the ministorum, but their eyes burned with a fervor that brooked no argument. Within weeks of their deployment across Carthax Prime, the delicate progress the Iron Requiem had fostered began to unravel. They did not preach heresy, they preached orthodoxy, and that was the problem. Their sermons declared that suffering was a crucible for the soul, a holy trial sent by the emperor to test the faithful. Material comfort, they warned, was a path to moral corruption. The message took root in a population conditioned by 10,000 years of imperial dogma to equate hardship with devotion. Brother Sergeant Kalen watched in disbelief as a community in Hive Primus turned away a convoy carrying water purifiers. The filtration systems the Marines had installed at great risk now sat idle, gathering dust. The local priest, emboldened by the missionaries, proclaimed that the pure, clean water was a sign of spiritual weakness. "They're choosing to starve," Kalen reported to Vortigern, his voice tight with a frustration that bordered on rage. "The food distribution centers we established are being abandoned. They believe that by suffering, they are proving their faith. The missionaries are undoing everything we fought and bled for." Vortigern confronted Cardinal Bishop Maxim in a chamber that had once belonged to the traitor governor. The cardinal was a politician in priest's robes, his face a mask of pious concern. Your methods challenge fundamental ecclesiarchy teachings, Maxim stated, his hands steepled before him. He made no apology. The Emperor tests humanity through hardship. Those who transcend their suffering prove their devotion. By eliminating it, you eliminate the very mechanism through which souls are purified. We are not eliminating suffering. Vortigern's voice was a low rumble, the sound of tectonic plates grinding together. We are reducing unnecessary suffering, the kind that serves no purpose except to feed the very corruption we came here to destroy. There is no unnecessary suffering, Maxim countered, his certainty absolute. All suffering serves the Emperor's divine plan, whether our mortal minds can comprehend that purpose or not. The impasse was total. Vortigern escalated the matter to Inquisitor Morn, requesting intervention against missionary activities that were actively jeopardizing the planet's stability. Her response came over a secure Vox channel, her voice devoid of emotion. The Ministorum has allies at the highest levels of the Senatorum Imperialis. Their teachings are orthodox, even if their effects are catastrophic. Moving against them requires evidence of active heresy, not merely counterproductive policy. I cannot order their cessation without provoking a political firestorm. She paused. Welcome to the Imperium, Chapter Master. Results have never mattered as much as appearances. Vortigern cut the channel. He was alone, trapped between imperial institutions whose doctrines were at war with each other. He made his choice. He would not attack the missionaries, but he would attack their logic. He began a new project, one that required data slates and analysts, not bolters and chainswords. He ordered his librarians and specialists to document every correlation between missionary activity and the resurgence of chaos indicators, the psychic disturbances, the nightmare patterns, the rising suicide rates. If their doctrine serves chaos, their doctrine is heresy, regardless of its orthodox language. Vortigern reasoned to his command staff. The evidence will speak for itself. It was Kalen who proposed the second front in this new, silent war. We can't stop them from preaching, but we can continue our work in secret, he suggested. Underground networks, trusted local officials who saw the benefits of our methods. We can create distribution systems that operate outside their oversight. Vortigern looked at his sergeant, a warrior who was becoming a strategist of a different kind. We become conspirators against our own allies, the chapter master observed, the words tasting like ash. We become whatever we need to become to serve the Emperor's true purpose, Kalen replied. Isn't that what adaptation means? The Iron Requiem began to operate on two levels. Publicly, they maintained a strained cooperation with the ecclesiarchy's presence. Secretly, they worked to undermine its most damaging effects, becoming saboteurs of the very faith they were sworn to protect. The moral complexity of the position settled on Vortigern like a shroud, heavier than any armor. It was a compromise that troubled him deeply, but less than the only alternative, abandoning Carthax Prime to the damnation he had sacrificed so much to prevent. The entity's return was not a storm, but a change in the psychic weather. It began as a darkening of the spiritual atmosphere across Carthax Prime, a subtle pressure that librarian Theon felt as a taste of old ash and a cold spot in the warp. He detected the shift first, a renewed feeding activity that spread like a contagion through the population's restored despair. His report to Chapter Master Vortigern was delivered with an urgency that bordered on alarm. It is stronger than before, Theon stated, his face a mask of grim focus. The missionaries' work. It has provided more sustenance than 3 years of open rebellion. Chosen suffering, it seems, produces a purer psychic output than the suffering we impose through war. The entity is not merely feeding, it is gorging itself. The implications cascaded through the strategium. The careful balance the Iron Requiem had maintained was broken. The entity's return was no longer a distant threat measured in generations. It was an immediate crisis measured in months. Vortigern convened an emergency council of his senior officers. The options laid out on the hololithic table were all unpalatable. First Captain Theron articulated the first. We eliminate the missionary presence by force. It was a military solution to a spiritual problem, an act that would solve the crisis on Carthax Prime, but create an immediate political war with the ecclesiarchy, likely drawing the wrath of the Inquisition down upon the chapter itself. Chief Librarian Malvox offered the second. We could allow the entity to manifest, then defeat it again. The strategy was monstrous. It would provide undeniable proof of the connection between the missionaries' teachings and chaos corruption, but at a cost of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. The third option was the final failure. We evacuate and request exterminatus, Vortigern said, the words tasting like poison. It would destroy Carthax Prime, the entity, and everything the campaign had achieved. It was Brother Sergeant Kalen who broke the grim silence. There is a fourth option. We do not use force. We use the truth. We expose the situation publicly, through official channels. We force the ecclesiarchy to defend a doctrine that demonstrably enables chaos. We make them choose between their dogma and their duty to the emperor. The proposal was audacious, a blade aimed at the heart of imperial politics. We would be sacrificing the chapter's political standing to save one world, Theron observed, his pragmatism a cold weight in the room. We would be branded heretics. We would be establishing a precedent that might save countless worlds, Kalen countered, his voice burning with conviction. If we prove that certain imperial practices feed the great enemy, we create the grounds to reform them. What is the point of our survival if we allow the Imperium to rot from within? The debate raged for hours, splitting the command staff. Some argued for withdrawal to protect the chapter and its hard-won knowledge. Others sided with Kalen, believing that political risk was a necessary cost of moral action. Vortigern listened to every argument, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. His decision, a synthesis of pragmatism and audacity. We will pursue exposure, he declared, but not as a public challenge. We will not declare war. We will build a coalition. Inquisitor Morn has contacts, sympathetic ears in the conclave who value results over doctrine. We will feed them our evidence. The strategy required time the entity's recovery might not permit. While our political allies maneuver, Vortigern continued, his gaze sweeping across his captains, we will buy that time with blood. We will launch a new offensive against the entity's anchor points. He stood, his shadow falling across the hololithic map of the world they had fought so hard to save. We fight on two fronts. A military war against the chaos threat. A political war against its institutional causes. Victory will require success on both. The order was given. The Iron Requiem prepared for battle once more. As Marines armed themselves for a new hunt, encrypted data packages streamed from the flagship's transmitters, carrying the truth of Carthax Prime to distant, powerful figures whose response would determine not just the fate of a world, but the future of a chapter. The entity had learned. Its defeat had been a lesson in survival, and its new strategy was one of insidious adaptation. Its anchor points were no longer concentrated in great, corrupt structures of stone and steel. They had dispersed, becoming a contagion within the population itself, embedding fragments of corruption in ordinary citizens whose quiet suffering now fed the warp presence without their knowledge. Librarian Theon coordinated the hunt, his psychic senses stretched to their absolute limit as he strained to detect a taint that had learned to hide. The task was monumental. Screening 19 billion souls was an impossibility. "We cannot boil the ocean to find a single drop of poison," Theon admitted to the Command Council. "The resources required would exceed the chapter's total capacity for a century. We must focus. We must identify the high-value targets, individuals whose suffering produces a disproportionate psychic output." His analysis, cross-referenced with data from Inquisitor Morn's remaining assets, revealed a sickening pattern. The most significant anchor-bearers were not random victims. They were the most devout followers of the returned ecclesiarchy missionaries. Their penitential disciplines, the ritual fasting, the public flagellation, the prolonged isolation, produced precisely the kind of concentrated, willful agony the entity required. The missionaries were not just enabling the entity, they were farming for it. "We target the missionaries," Brother Sergeant Kalen stated, his voice flat and hard. "They are the source, systematically creating new anchor points. If we disrupt their activities, we slow the entity's recovery regardless of how many existing anchors we eliminate." The proposal hung in the air, a violation of unspoken laws. First Captain Theron's reply was swift and absolute. "We cannot attack ecclesiarchy personnel. The political consequences would be catastrophic. The chapter would be declared excommunicate traitoris." He paused, his mind processing the tactical reality. "But we can protect the citizens of Carthax Prime from voluntary self-harm. That falls within our mandate to maintain order." The reframing was a masterpiece of Imperial logic. The mission changed. Marine squads deployed not to hunt anchors, but to prevent civil unrest. They established security cordons around communities where missionary activity was most intense. Penitential gatherings were declared public safety risks. The missionaries screamed blasphemy and heresy. The Marines, their helmets hiding any expression, simply ignored them, their voxcasters repeating the cold, legalistic justification. The intervention had an immediate effect. Psychic indicators in the secured districts improved as the entity's food supply was choked off. But the missionaries adapted, moving their activities underground, conducting their rituals in secret locations the Marines struggled to find. It was Scout Aspirant Vex who proved unexpectedly vital. Shaped by a youth spent surviving the rebellion's chaos, he saw patterns that eluded his superiors. "They won't meet where augurs can find them," Vex explained to his sergeant, his voice still carrying the rough edges of the underhive. "They will meet where the suffering feels authentic. Abandoned habs, forgotten medici wards, places where they can believe their pain is a secret between them and their God. I was one of them once, not a follower, but a soul desperate for meaning. I understand the hunger they exploit." His insights guided the Iron Requiem's operations with chilling precision. Secret gatherings were disrupted before they could generate significant psychic resonance. The entity's recovery slowed to a crawl, but the victory came at a cost. The missionaries painted the Marines as oppressors, as godless machines denying the faithful their right to worship. Citizens who had been denied their rituals began to see the chapter not as protectors, but as tyrants. The Iron Requiem's reputation, so carefully built, began to erode. "We are winning the battle against the entity," Kalen observed grimly in a report to Vortigern, "while losing the war for the hearts of the people. If the population turns against us completely, we lose the cooperation that made our methods possible in the first place. Vortigern read the report, acknowledging the terrible paradox. "We buy time," he transmitted back, his words carrying the weight of command. "Time for our political efforts to mature. If we can discredit the missionaries' teachings through official channels, we can restore our standing." He paused. "Until then, we accept being hated." The political counteroffensive reached its terminus in a chamber of shadow and starlight, a sealed sanctum where the inquisitorial conclave for the subsector convened. The Iron Requiem's evidence arrived not as a simple report, but as an indictment. 18 months of meticulously correlated data, a cold, mathematical testament to the link between the ecclesiarchy's missionary work and the resurgence of chaos. Inquisitor Vashti Morn presented the case herself, her voice a blade in the oppressive silence. Before her sat figures whose collective authority could unmake worlds. She staked her reputation, her very life, on the validity of the data. "The pattern is undeniable," she concluded, the hololithic displays shifting to show graphs where spikes in penitential activity perfectly mirrored spikes in psychic corruption. Lord Inquisitor Varant, a man whose face was a mask of ancient weary power, steepled his fingers. "The data is compelling, Inquisitor, but its implications are troubling. If we accept that standard ecclesiarchy practices enable chaos, we challenge teachings that have governed imperial faith for 10 millennia. The alternative is worse," Morn countered, her gaze unwavering. "If we ignore evidence that saves worlds because it challenges doctrine, we become complicit in the very corruption we swore an oath to destroy." The debate fractured the conclave along ancient fault lines. Representatives from the Ordo Malleus, long at odds with the Ministerum's spiritual arrogance, saw an opportunity. Those with deep alliances to the ecclesiarchy resisted, their arguments circling back to the sanctity of tradition. It was the pragmatists of the Ordo Xenos, men and women who cared only for what worked, who tipped the balance. The ruling, when it came, was a masterpiece of imperial compromise. It was not a mandate, not a condemnation. It was an advisory opinion. It stated that certain penitential practices, while doctrinally sound, may create conditions favorable to chaos corruption and should be suspended pending further investigation. It was weaker than Vortigern had hoped, but it was enough. The advisory provided the political cover he needed. Within a week, Cardinal Bishop Maxim withdrew his missionaries from Carthax Prime, his official reason citing critical resource reallocation. He did not admit defeat, but he had been defeated. On the planet, the change was almost immediate. Deprived of its accelerated feeding, the entity's presence faded. Librarian Thayan's reports grew less urgent. The psychic atmosphere cleared. The threat was now dormant, but not eliminated. A state of armed truce that might hold for centuries. Aboard the inevitable verdict. Chapter Master Vortigern surveyed the final reports with a profound sense of exhaustion. He had won. He had conquered a world and then protected it from the Imperium itself. But the costs were still being counted. "We set out to answer a simple question," he said, his voice low. He was alone in the strategium with First Captain Theron, the hololith showing a pacified, stable Carthax Prime. How many space marines does it take to conquer a planet? The answer proved more complex than anyone anticipated. "What is the answer, Chapter Master?" Theron asked. Vortigern turned from the display. "The answer is that conquering is the easy part. Holding what you have conquered requires capabilities we barely developed. Protecting it requires opposing institutions we are sworn to serve. 1,000 space marines, or 800, can take a world. keeping it safe requires something we haven't built yet. What would that something be? A new doctrine, Vortigern said, the words feeling solid, real. A new understanding of what Space Marines can become. We proved concepts on Carthax Prime that have implications for the entire Adeptus Astartes, whether those implications lead to reform or persecution. That now depends on factors beyond our control. He moved to his personal command console, the amber light of the screen illuminating his scarred features. He began to compose, not a report for the Administratum archives, but a new text. It was a doctrinal analysis, a philosophical treatise, a warrior's testament intended for other chapters, for other masters facing impossible odds. If his insights spread, they might change the galaxy. If they were suppressed, Carthax Prime would remain a secret, a forgotten anomaly. The Iron Requiem's departure from Carthax Prime began after nearly 3 years of occupation. The first troop carriers of the Imperial Guard broke atmosphere, their hulls clean, their insignia sharp against the scarred sky. They were forces better suited to the long, grinding peace that followed war, a duty for which Space Marines, instruments of violent resolution, were never intended. Chapter Master Vortigern oversaw the transition himself, a giant in soot-stained gold moving among mortals. He ensured the programs his chapter had bled to establish were understood, that the delicate peace they had forged would not be shattered by the blunt application of standard Imperial doctrine. His best hope for this continuity was Colonel Vestra Maxim, commander of the 47th Carthax Rifles, a regiment raised from the planet's own recovered population. Her soldiers had lived through the rebellion and its aftermath. They understood the cost of failure. "You're leaving us with an impossible task," Maxime stated during their final briefing. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of the 19 billion souls now under her protection. "You expect us to maintain improvement programs the Administratum refuses to fund, to suppress a chaos influence the ecclesiarchy denies exists, to govern a population that can't decide whether to trust us or fear us. You're beginning with advantages no Guard regiment has ever possessed," Vortigern countered, his gaze sweeping over the restored cityscape. "You have our intelligence, our operational precedents, and a population that has already seen what is possible. The task is not impossible, it is merely unprecedented." "In the Guard," Maxime replied, her words clipped, "that is what makes it impossible." The campaign's changes were not limited to the world. Brother Sergeant Kalen stood before his chapter master and made a request that violated a millennium of tradition. He asked to remain behind, to be transferred to an advisory capacity. Vortigern studied the warrior, a Marine who now found as much purpose in building as he had once found in destruction. "You have become something other than what you were," Vortigern observed. "The chapter needs warriors. Does it need builders?" "The chapter needs both," Kalen insisted. "You proved that here. Let me continue proving it." Vortigern denied the request. The chapter had bled 112 brothers to conquer this world. It could not spare a veteran of Kalen's caliber for an indefinite garrison. But he offered a different path. "Write your doctrine, Sergeant. Document your methods. If the chapter can integrate what you have learned, your service here will continue through every warrior who follows you." That is a legacy greater than one man on one world. The final departure ceremony drew crowds that filled the primary plaza of Hive Primus. The citizens of Carthax, who should have feared the angels of death, stood in silent, solemn respect. They watched the giants who had chosen to save them, a stark contrast to the usual aftermath of Imperial reconquest, which left populations grateful only to have survived. Scout aspirant Vex, his implantation nearing completion, watched the ceremony with the cold, analytical detachment of his generation. "We're leaving something behind," he observed to Kalen, his mentor. "But we're also taking something with us. Carthax Prime changed us as much as we changed it." Kalen nodded, his gaze fixed on the faces in the crowd. "Every campaign changes the warriors who fight it. This world changed us more than most, because we allowed it to. Whether that proves to be wisdom or weakness depends entirely on what we do next." The last of the Iron Requiem's Thunderhawks lifted from the planet's surface. As their engines burned through the upper atmosphere, the crowds below did not scatter. They watched until the ships were nothing more than departing stars. The chapter was gone, leaving a world to its own uncertain future. But they carried with them the true spoils of war, the lessons learned, paid for in blood and faith. 5 years after the Iron Requiem's fleet had departed Carthax Prime, the campaign's true legacy began to manifest. It was not a monument or a medal, but a document. Titled Principles of Preservative Conquest, Chapter Master Vortigern's doctrinal analysis circulated through the subsectors not by official decree, but through the Imperium's hidden arteries of information. It was copied by chapter serfs in secret scriptoriums, transmitted psychically between librarians across voids of silent black, and discussed in hushed tones within training cadres where young Marines first learned their craft. The document was a direct challenge to assumptions that had governed the Adeptus Astartes for 10,000 years. Its core argument was as simple as it was heretical. Space Marines served the Emperor best when they protected humanity, not merely when they defeated its enemies. Conquest that destroyed what it claimed, it argued, served nothing but statistics. Reactions were as varied as the chapters themselves. Conservative brotherhoods, steeped in traditions of uncompromising warfare, dismissed the analysis as a dangerous deviation from proven methods. Yet, more progressive chapters embraced its concepts, finding validation for their own experimental approaches. The Salamanders, long devoted to civilian protection, began to formalize methods the Iron Requiem had pioneered through necessity. The Imperial Fists, masters of the siege, incorporated Vortigern's population preservation concepts into their defensive doctrines. Even the Ultramarines, the staunchest guardians of Codex orthodoxy, acknowledged in their internal reports that the adaptive application of fundamental principles might require expanding the scope of those principles. But the light of this new philosophy cast long, dark shadows. On Terra, certain factions among the High Lords viewed the Iron Requiem's approach with deep suspicion. Space Marines who could govern, who could build alliances, who thought beyond the immediate application of the bolt gun, represented a threat to the delicate political balance that kept the chapters constrained and dependent. Inquisitorial scrutiny on the Iron Requiem intensified. Observers appeared at their deployments, their faces hidden behind symbols of authority, documenting methods and evaluating compliance with regulations whose interpretations grew stricter by the cycle. The message was clear. Innovation would be tolerated only within ever-narrowing boundaries. Vortigern navigated this pressure with a political acumen forged in the fires of Carthax. He maintained an unshakable public loyalty to imperial authority while quietly continuing the work that authority suspected. The doctrine spread, not through official channels, but through the ancient networks of brotherhood that Marines had always used to share knowledge. The most powerful argument, however, was not written on a data slate. It was written in blood and survival. Kalen, now promoted to the rank of captain and commanding his own company, applied the lessons of Carthax to campaigns throughout the subsector. His methods yielded results that no analyst could ignore. Lower marine casualties, higher population survival rates, and pacification timelines that were a fraction of conventional campaigns. The evidence accumulated, world by world. "We are winning arguments through results," Kalen reported during a chapter conclave. "Every world we conquer without destroying it proves our methods work. Eventually, even the High Lords must acknowledge effectiveness." First Captain Theron, ever the pragmatist, offered a chilling counterpoint. "Or they will eliminate the evidence by eliminating us. Institutional survival requires knowing when to advance and when to consolidate." This debate within the chapter mirrored a larger, silent schism growing throughout the Adeptus Astartes. The galaxy was changing, the threats were multiplying, resources were diminishing, and the old certainties were crumbling. Adaptation was no longer optional. It was necessary. Vortigern, now approaching his 500th year of service, contemplated the legacy he would leave behind. He had taken a conventional chapter and forged it into something new. "We answered their question," he reflected to himself, staring at a star chart of the Carthax system. "But the answer raised 1,000 more. How many space marines to conquer a planet? Fewer than anyone believed, if you are willing to conquer without destroying. The real question is whether the Imperium can accept that truth." His decision was made. He began drafting messages, coded with the highest ciphers of the Librarius, not to the High Lords or the Administratum, but to other chapter masters whose own quiet experiments paralleled his own. A movement was growing, unofficial and unsanctioned, seeking to transform what the Angels of Death could become. The Carthax Prime campaign, decades after its conclusion, had become a ghost haunting the halls of the Adeptus Astartes. In some training facilities, it was taught as a model of adaptive conquest. In others, it was presented as a cautionary tale of doctrinal deviation. Its lessons, either way, persisted, shaping how a new generation of Space Marines approached their sacred duty long after the Iron Requiem's fleet had vanished into the void. On the world itself, the long, slow work of recovery continued. Colonel Vestra Maxime, her hair now streaked with gray, still commanded the Carthax Rifles. Her regiments maintained the unorthodox programs the Iron Requiem had established, adapting them to the grinding realities of imperial bureaucracy. The planet's population grew, its manufactorums coughed smoke back into the sky, and its tithe ships, laden with grain and materiel, once again joined the endless processions feeding the Imperium's distant wars. The Chaos entity remained a silent prisoner in its own domain, its influence suppressed by a world that had been denied the sustenance of absolute despair. A quiet vigil of librarians, drawn from a dozen different chapters, monitored its dormancy, a watch that might continue for centuries, the unending price of a victory that could never be total. The citizens who had lived through the rebellion aged, their memories of fire and terror passing into stories told to children who knew the Angels of Death only as legends. They were not remembered as mere slaughterers. They were the ones who had chosen to save. Captain Kalen returned to Carthax Prime on the 50th anniversary of its pacification. The scars of 100 campaigns were etched onto his armor and his face. He walked the streets of Hive Primus, a place he had once patrolled as a sergeant, his footfalls echoing in a city that was alive because of choices he and his brothers had made. Accompanying him was Brother Vex, the feral aspirant from the Underhive, now a full battle brother of the First Company, his presence a living testament to the campaign's legacy. They stood before a simple, unadorned memorial of black stone, its surface inscribed with the names of the 112 Marines who had fallen to secure this world. "We made something here," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble inside his helmet. "Something that survived us. That's rare for our kind. Usually, we leave only destruction and fear in our wake." Vex, his gaze fixed on the endless hive stretching to the horizon, remained silent for a long moment. "Is that enough?" he finally asked. "One world, when there are millions drowning in the dark?" "One world proves what is possible," Kalen replied, turning from the memorial. "And possibility is a contagion far more potent than any plague. Other worlds will learn from Carthax Prime. Other chapters will see the proof of it. We planted a seed. Whether it grows into a forest is beyond our control. But the seed is real." The campaign's ultimate significance was not military, but philosophical. Space Marines existed to fight the Emperor's enemies. But here, the Iron Requiem had been forced to offer a new definition of victory: that humanity must survive not just the battle, but its aftermath. This simple truth was a profound heresy, challenging 10,000 years of doctrine that had taught the Imperium to burn its own limbs to cauterize a wound. It suggested that the Imperium's own methods, the endless grinding suffering it inflicted to maintain control, were themselves a primary food source for the very chaos it claimed to fight. "The eternal war cannot be won through eternal warfare," Kalen concluded, his words meant for Vex, but also for himself. "We must find another way. Carthax Prime showed us the beginning of that path. And if the Imperium refuses to follow?" Vex's question was sharp, pragmatic, the query of a warrior forged in a broken world. Kalen looked at the younger Marine, seeing the future of his chapter in those unblinking eyes. "Then we walk it alone. We prove its worth through our example. Battle by battle, world by world. Eventually, necessity will overcome resistance. The alternative is extinction." Their pilgrimage concluded. Their shuttle ascended through an atmosphere still bearing the chemical scars of the orbital war. Below them, a planet continued its recovery, one of billions, a single point of light in a galaxy that might never learn from its example. The question that had begun their campaign had been answered, but the answer pointed toward a far larger, more dangerous question. What should the Imperium become? And could humanity survive without transforming the very angels of death who protected it? Chapter Master Vortigern stood before the full muster of the Iron Requiem. 700 battle brothers, their armor bearing the scars of campaigns, fought across half a sector, filled the fortress monastery's grand hall. Banners depicting victories and sacrifices dating back millennia hung from the vaulted ceiling. 50 years had passed since the conquest of Carthax Prime. 100 engagements had been fought since, each one a crucible where the lessons of that world were tested, tempered, and proven. This was a ceremonial occasion, his formal designation of a successor. His body, a vessel of gene-forged perfection, was finally succumbing to the weight of 5 centuries, showing signs that even Space Marine physiology could not indefinitely postpone. But his final address would not be about endings, it would be about a beginning. "Brothers," his voice began, the vox grill of his helmet carrying the words to every warrior, each a living part of the legacy he had built. "We began our transformation on a world called Carthax Prime. We were sent there to answer a simple, brutal question. How many Space Marines does it take to conquer a planet?" The hall was utterly silent. Every warrior present knew the campaign's history. The veterans who had walked the streets of Hive Secundus stood beside the new generation forged in its aftermath. All listened. The answer we discovered was not the one the Imperium expected. The question itself was flawed. It assumed that conquest requires destruction. It believed that planets fall only when their defenders are annihilated, their cities burned to ash, their populations broken by absolute terror. We proved otherwise. Vortigern's scarred face, visible within his unsealed helmet, showed an emotion so rare it was almost unrecognizable. 847 Space Marines can conquer a world of 19 billion souls. Not through overwhelming force, but through precision. Not through terror alone, but through understanding the enemy's will. Not through destruction, but through the preservation of what makes any victory meaningful. His voice grew harder, a hammer striking an anvil. The Imperium has forgotten what victory means. For 10,000 years, we have fought only to survive, accepting whatever terrible costs that survival demands. We have burned worlds to deny them to our enemies. We have slaughtered populations to halt the spread of corruption. We have confused the absence of defeat with the presence of triumph. Carthax Prime taught us a different truth. Victory means humanity not just surviving, but thriving. Victory means a world that remains productive after we have departed. It means a population that chooses loyalty over subjugation. It means a future that extends beyond the immediate crisis. Victory means building, not just breaking. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of ceramite-clad giants who had become something more than their predecessors had ever imagined. We are Space Marines. We are the Emperor's angels of death. That purpose remains sacred. But we are also humanity's protectors, not just from the Xenos and the heretic, but from the internal decay that makes those external enemies possible. The answer to the question, then, is this, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. It takes fewer Space Marines to conquer a planet, when those Marines understand what conquest truly is. Numbers matter less than wisdom. Force matters less than purpose. Destruction matters less than what is allowed to rise from its ashes. Vortigern raised his power sword high, the same blade that had pierced the heart of the last Chaos Sorcerer in Hive Septimus 50 years ago. Its energy field hummed in the silent hall. The Iron Requiem has learned lessons the galaxy desperately needs. Carry those lessons forward. Teach them to every world you conquer, every enemy you face, every Marine who follows in your footsteps. The eternal war cannot be won through war alone, but it can be won. We have proven that. Now, prove it again and again, until the Imperium remembers the light it was created to spread. A single, unified roar answered him. 700 voices, as one, thundered the chapter's war cry, a sound that shook the ancient stones. 700 weapons were raised in salute. The Iron Requiem endured. The lessons of Carthax Prime would not be forgotten. And somewhere in the galaxy's unending darkness, worlds awaited conquest by Space Marines who had finally learned how to save what they were sworn to protect. How many Space Marines does it take to conquer a planet? As many as are needed, and not one death more.